It was December of 1999 when she infested our quiet Midwestern home. My father called me from downstairs. I assumed it was time for dinner. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs and had his hand up in an effort to keep me from coming down. The moment I saw the panic in his eyes, I knew something was wrong. "I want you to listen to me very carefully," he said. My heart started to race as he continued. "It's very important that you keep your eyes on me. You're going to notice someone else in our home, but you must ignore her as much as possible." I almost started laughing. My 12-year-old mind trying to comprehend what he was getting at, assuming this was some sort of out-of-character joke. Before I could respond, he continued. "She's going to whisper things, follow you, and whatever else she can to get your attention. It's going to be very difficult, son, but you must never interact with her. I promise she will leave, but only if you pretend she isn't there. And try not to think about her. Promise me." There were so many things I wanted to ask him, but I was too frightened and confused. I managed to spit out, "Okay, Dad." "All right, come downstairs. It's time for dinner. Hurry. I've made her stronger just by telling you, but I had to. I can't afford you looking at her by mistake. Trust me. Now stay focused," he barked. I did as I was told and slowly crept down the stairs, keeping my eyes glued to my father as he backpedaled into the kitchen. I felt the temperature drop significantly as I reached the first floor. I smelled a familiar, sickening and sour scent in the air. It reminded me of the time a raccoon died in our wall and stunk up the house for a whole week. My father and I sat down at the table at the same time. My sister was across from me. Her head hung, and her eyes stared at the empty porcelain plate in front of her. My mother pulled a casserole out of the oven. Her eyes were swollen and tear-stained. I kept my focus on my family, but out of the corner of my eye, I could see a blurry mess of dark, matted hair and sickly grey skin. There was no energy in the kitchen, drained of all the warmth and laughter that usually accompanied our meals. My sister grabbed my knee under the table and whispered, "Can you see her too?" I nodded. "Quiet!" my father hissed. The woman walked forward with wet, crackling footsteps. The smell was nauseating. She crept towards the table, stopping directly behind my sister, only a few inches away, and rested a decrepit hand on her shoulder. She winced in fear and stared at me. I immediately put my head down. My mother served our dinner, doing her best to pretend as if everything was okay. I could see my father clutching my sister's hand under the glass table in an attempt to keep her from completely losing it. My sister spent the entire dinner with a skeletal hand on her shoulder. Nearly inaudible whispers spewed from the woman's mouth and filled the room like white noise. And that's how we lived for months, doing our best to live a normal life despite the ever-present, unwanted guest. Even if we left the house, she was somehow able to follow us. Whenever the four of us were in the car, she could be seen in the rear-view mirror or standing on the side of the road. My parents didn't let anyone visit, never let us stay at friends' homes during the months of hell. It wasn't easy turning down fun-sounding occasions at such a social age. Kids at school were always involved in getaways that I usually attended. But due to this situation, I was forced to deny every single one. This hurt me socially, as I was soon becoming the outcast kid that no one wanted to be associated with, meaning there were more times I was alone, meaning there were more times she was there. It wasn't just me who was singled out. Each of us had our fair share of heckling from her. She would test our patience, and any falter, any twitch of an eyebrow, any tightening of lips, any sign at all that her attempts of getting our attention had hit someone, she would hone in on that person for at least a day, if not more. It would take the rest of us to stop them from caving in. We were able to whisper to one another when it was absolutely necessary to discuss her presence, if she wasn't too close. My father made us promise to never tell anyone. That was the only way to quarantine her, the parasite of attention. We concluded that she infected a single household at a time, unable to be seen by anyone outside the home unless their mind had been tainted with knowledge of her existence. I learned a few years later that my father was the reason for her arrival. His sister, back in the 70s, had been infected from another, and it followed my aunt into their home. In 1999, for whatever reason, my father struggled to keep the thought of her at bar. In turn, he brought her back into his life, and ours. We kept the promise of keeping her a secret from others, and it was the hardest thing we've ever done. All of us tried leaving the house as a group, and she followed. We couldn't bring ourselves to break our family apart. It was easier being together than being apart. Besides the comfort of being with loved ones during a turbulent time, it also made it so we could bolster each other if someone looked close to cracking. It was a foolproof system when we were together. But that couldn't always be the case. There are times when you have to be alone. When you shower, when you go to the toilet, or worse, when you sleep. These were the times where you'd notice a breath behind your ear, or wet, dank hair slowly lowered and resting on the back of your neck. This is where she had her fun. It was hardest for my mother, who was stuck alone with her while we were at school and my father was at work. Everything changed the day my mother broke. It was a snowy February night. We had finished dinner and my mother decided to go to bed early. She was sitting on their bed, making herself almost impossible to ignore. My mother couldn't take it. I heard her screaming from the bedroom, demanding that she leave us alone. My father sprinted upstairs to try and stop her. That was the last I ever saw of my mother. A pool of blood on the white carpet was all that remained. The woman was still there, but my mother was gone. In the following weeks, she whispered to me. She told me I could see my mother again. All I had to do was look and ask how. I never did. The reason I am telling you is because I want you to think about her. I saw her again this morning for the first time in 18 years. I cannot afford to lose my wife or children to the parasite. I need you to think about her dark hair and grey skin. Think about her in your home so that she may leave mine. You're already infected, and eventually you're going to notice a woman in your home. You must ignore her. It's for your own good. I'm so sorry. We moved out of our last house a week ago, and I'm glad we did. It was definitely not safe there, especially for a man like me who has a young family to take care of. I think if I hadn't decided to get the hell out of there, I would have failed my family, and I would have lost them too, eventually. There was nothing obviously wrong with the house, actually. I suppose it was just a regular detached family home in a suburban neighborhood. I think the first thing that struck me as off about it is the fact that all the houses in the street had been built sometime in the 1980s. The odd bit about that is the fact that nobody had actually lived there in almost 3.5 decades. Nobody had ever lived in that house. But what could be wrong with that? It didn't ring any alarm bells, apart from the normal sort, like, does the electricity still work, and is the boiler outdated? On top of that, we had to check if there were any pests or squatters. Nope, nothing there. The house was well built and hadn't let anything in. So it seemed, at least. Once we were settled in, we were actually very happy there. I think, although I find it hard to believe now, we wanted the house to be our home for a good long time. Bizarrely, it just felt so perfect and right, when actually there was something very, deeply, inherently wrong about the place. The tensions began one typical grey London morning. My wife was going to drop off our 4-year-old at school, which usually takes about half an hour. It was the oddest thing. As soon as she shut the door behind her, and I was alone, I became aware of a feeling that I hadn't felt before. You could describe it as a feeling of being watched, but I think it was something else. A feeling of tension and discomfort arising from, well, nothing. Nothing at all happened. No creaks, no bumps, and no whispers. I had the heating on, it was December, and was listening to Classic FM on the radio. On first inspection, it appeared to be a comfortable, peaceful environment, ideal for sitting down and getting on with my work. But it wasn't. I felt sort of agitated. I suppose it was just down to this being a new house that I had only slept in for a few nights, and I got on with my work. Except I didn't. I couldn't settle down and concentrate. I found myself wandering around the house, walking slowly around every room. There were a few boxes of things that still needed to be unpacked, and some rooms that were still quite bare. I refused to accept it, but a tiny part of my subconscious expected that there was an intruder in the house. I was in the room farthest away from my study, so I could just about hear Bach's cello suite, or whatever the heck it was playing upstairs. I stayed at the window, waiting for my wife to turn up in her car. It was incredible how quickly the mood shifted as soon as my wife stepped into the house. As soon as I was no longer alone, the uncomfortable feeling lifted, and I could actually feel the warmth of the central heating and my tea with a teaspoon of honey in it actually tasted sweet. Even the rain clouds, which had started to drizzle outside, seemed friendlier. The next morning, I did the school run, just as a little experiment. I was driving back when I got a call from my wife. I don't think she wanted anything in particular, apart from some company. Her tone was very casual. It almost sounded forced, and she was only asking when I would be back, but in a prolonged way, as if she wanted to keep the call as long as possible. I had some idea why she was calling. She was getting the feeling too. She probably felt it more, because women are more tuned into these subtleties in an environment. She didn't mention anything when I returned regarding the feeling, but through her smile, I could see that she was a tiny bit spooked. To be honest, it was nothing really, just the feeling that people sometimes get. The only odd things about it were that it happened when we were alone, and that it happened to both of us. Well, still, some places are just like that. A house that hadn't been lived in for decades might take some time to warm up to its new owners, I guess. The next day, while my wife was out getting the groceries, I made a little discovery. The strange feeling grew more intense in certain parts of the house. In the upstairs bathroom, it was particularly strong, and there was a corridor that connected the dining room and the living room, where it was also quite noticeable. The thing about these places is that they were the only parts of the house with mirrors in them. With time, I came to hate those parts of the house and those mirrors. Nothing new happened for about a week. I just avoided being in the house by myself, and I noticed my wife did the same, although we never discussed the fact that we felt uncomfortable being alone. It was a new house. We didn't want to spoil our first days there with negativity. But a certain negativity hung about the place nevertheless. It was not obvious, it was not intense, but it was always there. I felt somewhat hostile, as if we were sharing the home with something. Something that didn't like us being around. I read up online, while my wife wasn't looking, that some places just have what they call negative energy. Apparently, this is the result of many things, such as poor lighting, bad feng shui, and bad things that have happened in the past in the place. Ironically, we installed brand new high-power light bulbs. My wife had a whole book on keeping good feng shui, and as for the whole bad things happening in the past thing, nobody had ever lived in the house before. I mean, how could anything bad have happened if nobody had lived there before? At least our little boy didn't seem affected. He was playing just as happily as ever with his toys. A work overload had preoccupied me and his mother lately, so we didn't spend as much time with him as usual. He didn't seem to mind. He even managed to invent an imaginary friend to play with. There was this one night, however, when I came home from work late to find my son in bed and my wife waiting for me in the living room. As soon as I came through the door, I was greeted with a thick, heavy presence. It gave me a bad feeling immediately. I knew at once that something was not right. And yet, everything seemed fine. We ate dinner in front of the television, washed up, and then got ready for bed. We both joined our son upstairs to sleep, and soon enough, we had both dozed off. Except, I was suddenly disturbed from my sleep. It was nothing unnatural. In fact, it was the very call of nature that woke me up. I needed to use the loo. I got up and put on my slippers and nightgown. It was absolutely freezing, being a winter's night. But when I stepped into the bathroom, I was shocked by how cold it was. It was not safe. How chilly it was in there. I looked at myself in the mirror for a bit, then sat on the toilet seat to do my business. That mirror was giving me a bad feeling. I kept imagining that I could see something moving around in the mirror, and yet there was nobody else in the room but me, not even a fly or a bug. It happened at least 3 times. Then I got up, washed my hands, and just stared into the mirror for a while, just to make sure. It eventually made me uneasy, so I hurried back to bed and actually found myself hiding my face in the duvet. I think I saw something moving in the mirror again the next night, and the next. I think I even saw a face in the downstairs hallway mirror as I walked past, for a split second. Of course, I knew it was only my imagination. Definitely just a side effect of all the negative energy in the place. It was getting more irritating than frightening, so I decided to ring up one of those priests, those spiritual sorts who know how to brighten up places with negative energy in them. She turned up while our son was at school, a frail old Japanese woman who must have been 80 years old at least. Her son dropped her off since she was very weak and unable to walk the distance. Anyway, she came in smiling faintly and telling us in broken English that she would just take a walk around the house to get used to it. My wife and I sat quietly in the living room. Personally, I don't think she was all too happy about the house being checked out by what she referred to as an exorcist. I showed her the web pages about clearing negative energy, and she agreed with a sigh. After all, it was good feng shui to have your house cleared. The spiritual woman came downstairs after about 10 minutes. In spite of how bony and old she was, she made the place feel very secure and comfortable. I almost wanted her to stay with us, so that we could be assured that we would have no negative energy. But something happened that made us wonder if it really was negative energies making our house the way it was. Anyway, she came into the living room and told us that she had burnt incense in some of the rooms and that she was going to go over the rooms again just to clear out any remaining negativity. But then she suddenly went stiff, and a quivering smile became a screwed up scowl, and her watery eyes hardened. We thought she was having a stroke and reached for the telephone to call an ambulance. Turns out, she was fine. She told us not to touch anything or move. We listened and watched, dumbfounded, as she rushed to the wall with impressive speed and pressed her ear against it. She whispered some words which we couldn't hear, and she seemed to be receiving a reply as her expression changed and contorted. Whatever she was hearing can't have been good, because she gave a shriek and sprang away from the wall. The room darkened noticeably, like when a cloud covers the sun. "You no live in this house!" The old woman grabbed my wife by the shoulders and shook her firmly as she said this. "Why not?" I asked, as my wife was too taken aback to reply. "Man in the walls!" she shrieked. "There is man, live in the walls, bad man in the walls!" The old woman hurried through the hallway and, without even putting her shoes on, stepped outside the house and urged us to come out with her. She called her son to pick her up on a little Nokia phone and refused to step back inside, even though she needed to sit down because of her frailty. I brought a chair outside for her and brought her shoes out too. We waited with her outside, and I can swear that when I went inside to fetch the chair, I was not the only one in that house. I cursed the old woman for making me so nervous. I was hearing whispers all over the house now. Her son picked her up, and when he saw her in a nervous state, he gave my wife and I an unfriendly look before driving away. That had gone poorly. We would have gotten mad at each other had it not been for what the old woman had said. Man in the walls. It was chilling to hear that, and the look of terror on the old woman's face convinced us that she was serious. But being modern cosmopolitans, we just agreed after some conversation that she was doing that to frighten us, or that she was just old and batty. We didn't want to believe her nonsense. But the phrase stuck with me. Man in the walls. I even admit I put my ear to the wall to see if I would hear anything. Nothing. We were more uneasy now than we had been before the spiritual had come. The tension gathered all day until at bedtime, and the house felt unnaturally dark. As I was slipping into bed, relieved that the day was over, a cry from my wife got me out of bed. She rushed into the bedroom with a look of utter horror on her face. "Man in the mirror!" she screamed. Man in the mirror!" I had enough sense to realize that she was not talking about the Michael Jackson hit. She was genuinely terrified. "Where?" "Bathroom. I saw it. I tell you. I believe you. I believe you." I had to believe her. I stormed into the bathroom and looked into the mirror. It was just a normal reflection. There was nothing there. I stood there for a while. Then I began to cry. "What's wrong with this bloody place?" I cried. "Man in the wall? Tell me, is there a man in the wall?" No, there isn't," my wife comforted me. "It was just my imagination, I'll bet you. It's just that damned old woman coming in here and telling us all this mumbo-jumbo about men in the walls. It's nothing at all." "Then what the hell have I been seeing? This place, it feels wrong. Just wrong." "Oh, nothing. Don't worry. There's nothing here. There can't be. Let's just get some sleep. That's what you need. Sleep." I was too tired to carry on with this. I forced myself to believe that there was nothing funny going on. I didn't convince myself. We went to bed, and I was about to turn out the light when my wife told me something that made me shudder. "You know, Daniel, our son, has been saying some weird things lately," she said. "Like what?" "Well, it might just be coincidence, but what that old woman said about a man in the walls, it seems to fit with something that Daniel has been talking about." "Oh, really? Do you know anything about his imaginary friend?" I chuckled. "Well, I know that Daniel spends an awful lot of time with it. What does he call it again?" "Wallman. Oh, yeah. Oh." I realized just then the creepy connection. Wallman. "Daniel's been saying things about his friend. He told me the other day that he's got a round face with black eyes and a big smile, and he's really thin so that he can fit in the wall. I found it cute at the time, but now, I don't know." I got the biggest chill I had got in a long time. "Well, there's more. We were in the park, just me and him. Nobody else was there. I asked him if he wanted to invite Wallman for a picnic. He said he couldn't. He told me that Wallman is only in our house and never leaves. That one made me laugh a bit when he told it to me. But then he gave me this serious, worried look and said, 'Don't worry, Mummy. Wallman doesn't like you and Daddy. He hates you. He says he only likes me.'" I shuddered and took a deep breath. The air suddenly felt colder and more hostile. "You know," I said to my wife after a period of silence. I really do think we should move out. I don't know if it's just a bad feeling I get about this place, or if maybe that old Japanese woman was right. This stuff is creeping me the hell out. I don't think I can sleep now. I don't feel safe. Nevertheless, we both managed to fall asleep after a bit more conversation on where we could move to. I had dreams. They were mostly just plain, random dreams. But one thing stuck out as different. I dreamt I came home to find the house empty. I called to see if anyone was home and turned on a few lights. I noticed very vividly there was somebody standing in the living room. It was a man's figure, very lean and about the height of a child. He was facing away from me. I could tell, but the light wouldn't turn on in that room, so I couldn't see any more. I think he was naked. In my dream, I called out, "Daniel?" But I felt certain that this was not my son. I was scared of this figure in the living room. The dream ended there and I woke up. I blamed all the weird events. They were affecting my sleep. I managed to get more shut-eye after that. No dreams this time. It was a Saturday next morning, so we had a bit of a lie-in. "I'm getting the kettle on. How many sugars would you like?" I asked my wife before going downstairs to the kitchen to make some tea. But as I waited for the kettle to boil, a voice caught my attention. It was Daniel. He was raising his voice. I found him looking up at the mirror in the downstairs corridor in a heated argument with somebody. "No, if you don't say sorry, I won't be your friend anymore," he cried. "Hello, Dan? You alright there, son?" I called to him. He ignored me outright. "No, no, 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 no!" he shrieked at whoever he was speaking to, and I saw tears on his cheeks. "I don't want to. You're not nice anymore." "Go away, go away," he began to screech. "I don't want to go with you." I rushed along and lifted him up, carrying him away from that mirror. His mother came downstairs, roused by the shouting. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked him. "Wallman. Wallman wants me to live with him in the walls. He wants to take me in the wall, but I told him I don't want to." "Oh God," I muttered, handing him to my wife, my voice shaking. "I can't put up with this nonsense any longer. Wallman, where the hell are you? Come out here, you asshole." I'd never spoken in front of my son like that before, but he didn't seem unsettled. He seemed glad that I was angry at his imaginary friend. My wife took him upstairs while I raged on for a bit. "Right," I said, when my wife came back downstairs. "We've got to get rid of these goddamn mirrors. They're creeping me the hell out." "It's okay, it's fine." "No, it's not fine. It can't be fine. It's like they're portals or something. Like there's evil coming straight out of them or some crazy nonsense like that." Okay, we need to calm down," she assured me. "Let's just get some breakfast sorted and we'll see how things go." We had breakfast in silence, and after a while, it all seemed okay. And then something happened that was amazing. Nothing. Nothing at all. There wasn't even a weird feeling of anxiety anymore. It felt like a normal home should. Weirder still, the next day was fine too, and nothing dodgy took place overnight. We kept the mirrors. I hadn't been entirely serious about throwing them out. I'd just been stressed out. Then a whole week went by, and it was Sunday again, without a single weird thing happening. Our house was beginning to at last feel like a home. We had less work, so we spent more time with Daniel, and he seemed to forget about his imaginary friend, which was actually a relief to us. That imaginary friend had seemed like something else. It seemed wrong to be coming from the imagination of a 4-year-old. We thought everything was going to be fine. But then, something made us think twice. Yellow mold had started to grow in circular patches around the house. The patches were about the size of footballs, and they gave off a rotten smell. We decided to leave it be for a while, but the patches turned up suddenly in more places, and they were too ugly and stinky to stay. We called in a man to investigate and sort out the mold problem, and while he worked, the 3 of us paid a visit to my parents-in-law. We got a call from the man dealing with the mold at about 8 o'clock in the evening. He sounded troubled, and he told us to come home quickly. We were very agitated throughout the car journey, and when we saw policemen standing around our home, my wife looked as though she would cry. A tall, fat policeman stopped us in our tracks as we made our way towards the front door. "Stop right there, sir," he said. "I highly doubt that you, and especially your wife, will want to see what's been found in your home. You ain't suspected, don't be afraid. But I tell you, mate, it's ghastly." He took off his hat and breathed out with disgust. "Mummy, Daddy, what's happening?" Daniel kept asking. But we just led him back to the car. I went back to the policeman, and the inspector came and told me I could come in. I went in to find that where the patches of mold had been, there were holes in the wall. Men in uniform and masks were carrying small objects in plastic bags out of the house. The mold specialist was sitting down with a cup of coffee on the sofa, his head in one hand. He seemed deeply troubled. I looked at him for a while and thought it might be better not to ask him what had happened, but I didn't need to. "You ain't seen what you had in your walls yet?" he asked me, his eyes bloodshot. "I ain't never done a job like this one. Bloody shocking." "What was in my walls?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Tell me, please. I can't bear it anymore." "Can't tell you myself, mate. Bloody shocking." Suddenly, the world around me became a blur, and I collapsed on the ground. I came to at my parents-in-law house. Had that been a dream? No, it was now 2 a.m. My son and my wife were upstairs, they told me. An inspector was waiting to speak to me. "What happened, Inspector? What was there in my house?" I asked, as patiently as I could. "Now, don't take this the wrong way, sir. We're not accusing you of anything. The things we found date back at least a decade, judging by the state they're in." "What did you find?" Then I was told, once I had promised to remain calm, that behind each of the 16 patches of mold, the bones of a small child had been found, curled up inside the walls. The children were all between the ages of 2 and 5, and were recognized as children that had gone missing in the area the past 30 years or so. Now, hearing that shook me about as much as it would shake anybody in my position. There was something else in the walls of that house, something evil, and had things happened differently, it might have taken my son into the wall like those other children. My wife and I still haven't gotten over our experiences in that house, although our son seems to be indifferent to the whole thing. He never got told about the children in the walls, and hopefully he'll never ask, so we won't have to tell him. He never mentions his imaginary friend, Wallman, and he seems to be happy enough in our new home, as do all of us. I don't want to tempt fate or anything, but our new place seems just right. Nothing weird going on here. But one thing bugs me, and I don't think it'll ever stop bugging me as long as I live. I still don't know what the heck it was in our house. I refer to it as Wallman because the name makes it seem less frightening. But I can't get over the fact that I actually had contact with a paranormal entity. I'm guessing it's still there in that building. Fat chance anybody wants to buy that house now, after the discovery made the local headlines. There's one more thing. A few days after he made his dreadful discovery, the mold specialist arranged to meet me at my workplace. He seemed deeply disturbed and told me that he had something, to quote, dead strange to show me. It was a picture he had taken on his mobile phone on the day he had been at our house. It was a picture of the mirror in the corridor. Although the quality was a little grainy, a face could be seen very clearly in the mirror. It just popped up at the bottom corner of the mirror. A white face with a wide, thin-lipped mouth and large black eyes. It had very clean, neat teeth. It didn't appear to have a nose or any hair, but perhaps it was just because of the quality of the image. It was grinning broadly, and its eyes were wide open. The picture was taken from an angle so that the photographer could not be seen, only the face and the rest of the room. But what scared me most about the face was the fact that it was there. It was actually there. Real photographic evidence of something paranormal that had been in our home all that time. Saw the bugger in the mirror and I didn't know what the bloody hell it was, so I snapped a shot and ran out of the bloody house, the man explained to me. He seemed shaken. Now, I'm not sure why he showed that to me. Perhaps he was frightened and just wanted to get it off his chest. Perhaps it was just fascinating or incredible to him. I don't care really, because now that I've seen photographic evidence, I won't stop thinking about it. I never truly, actually believed in the paranormal until then, but now I'm open-minded. I say my prayers before going to bed every night. I've started being superstitious and avoiding creepy places and walking under ladders and everything. I only have one mirror in my house now, in the bathroom, and I avoid it like the plague. Not to mention that I practice methods designed to keep my home free of negative energies. My wife likes that, after all. It is good feng shui. And sometimes, only sometimes, when I am alone at home and it is quiet, I press my ear to the wall and listen carefully. Then I look into my mirror for a while, just to make sure there isn't anything else there. Perhaps you should give it a go too. After all, some houses are strange, and some houses have been there for a very long time. With enough time, I think things come into existence in empty places that shouldn't be allowed to exist. You may find that those walls that protect you from the elements every day are in fact home to something that you might need protection from. And as for mirrors, I guess they are like doors into the wall. They show you not only what is behind you, but what's behind them. Trust me, if you see any strange faces in the mirror, there's a possibility there could be something in your walls. Afraid? My advice? Just brush your teeth quickly. It started as a joke. My wife and I host a lot of parties, and if you've ever done cleanup after a party, you know that people leave things behind. Hats and coats constantly, scarves, purses, whatever. One time, I found a pair of prescription glasses stuck between the couch cushions. They were thick lenses too, like Velma thick. I don't know how the owner made it out of the front door without them, let alone how they drove home. A lot of the time, we'll get a call the next day or next week, someone going, "Hey, so I haven't seen my jacket lately. Did I leave it at your place?" But sometimes, no one ever claims it. And Jenny and I, Jenny's my wife, we weren't about to call everyone who was at the party to ask if they're missing whatever we've found. So, we just chuck it in a wooden chest we've got in the closet and leave it in there until someone does come looking. So recently, we had a winter party, and someone left their pants here. Now, it was not that kind of party, so I was pretty surprised to find a pair of pants laying around afterward. They were snow pants, the kind you wear over your clothes to keep them warm and dry, and they were folded up and stored in the corner. I figured that someone probably had shown up in them to stay warm, then taken them off since they got inside. Between the warmth of the house and the warmth of the alcohol, they must have forgotten to put them back on when they left at the end of the night. Jenny flipped through her pictures from the evening, but didn't have any shots of anyone wearing those pants, so into the trunk they went. As Jenny was tossing them in, she commented, "I bet we could clothe a whole person with what's in here." We laughed, but then I got to thinking that she was probably right. So later on, I dug through the trunk, and sure enough, in addition to the pants, we had a button-down shirt, multiple jackets, several hats, a pair of gloves, a couple of scarves, and 2 pairs of shoes. While Jenny was out of the house that night, I put the shirt on a hanger, hung the jacket over it, clipped the gloves to the sleeves and the pants to the bottom, and wrapped a scarf around it. Then I hung the whole thing up in the hallway, plopped a hat on top, and put some shoes beneath it. The pants hung just to the ground, so at first glance, it really did look like someone lurking there, especially with the lights off. I heard the door slam when Jenny got home. She started to call out a greeting, but it abruptly cut off in a shriek. I came into the hallway, laughing, to find Jenny standing there with her hand to her chest, glaring at me. The clothes dummy swung quietly off to the side. "Real funny," she said. "You about gave me a heart attack." "I'm very sorry," I said, but I was laughing much too hard for her to believe me. "Yeah, you will be," she said with mock seriousness, but she was laughing too, now that she was past the initial shock. Anyway, I thought that was all extremely funny, right up until I got up in the middle of the night to go to the toilet. I walked into the bedroom, turned on the lights, and shouted loud, because Jenny had moved my clothes dummy into the bathroom and posed it sitting on the toilet. From the bedroom, I heard sleepy laughter. "Do you know what happens when you scare someone who's on his way to the bathroom?" I demanded. "Rags are under the sink. Clean up whatever you need to," Jenny called back. "A lesser man would have to clean up. I have iron self-control," I told her. "Is that why you screamed loudly enough to wake me up?" she teased. I didn't dignify that with a response. Also, I didn't have one. So this became a thing. Jenny and I would move the dummy around, and after a while, it wasn't even to scare each other anymore. We named him Albert, and he was just a feature of the house after a few weeks. We'd put him in the kitchen, the dining room, wherever. I came home a couple of days ago to find the clothes slumped to my chair in front of the TV, with one of my beers in his glove. I just got another beer and took a seat on the couch. Jenny came in later and said, "You're not going to move him?" "He was here first," I shrugged. "You're ridiculous," Jenny told me. and took Albert's beer. "He's not gonna like that," I said. Jenny laughed. "What's he gonna do about it?" That was a couple of days ago, like I said. Yesterday, I came home to find Albert hanging by the picture window at the back of the house. His clothes were splashed with something red, and there was a dripping knife wedged in one of his gloves. It was a pretty gruesome sight, and I applauded Jenny's ingenuity. "Did he get you, honey?" I called. No response, obviously. She wasn't about to give up the joke that easily. "Hey, the stuff is dripping on the floor," I said, loudly enough for her to hear me wherever she was hiding. "I think it's staining the carpet." Still, nothing. So I got a paper towel and wiped up the quote-unquote blood, then took Albert's knife away from him. Whatever Jenny had used really did look like blood. I was starting to get uncomfortable. "Honey? Okay, you got me. Joke's over." Still, no response. So I went looking. I went through the entire house and couldn't find her anywhere. Her car was out front, but Jenny was just missing. I called her phone, but it rang through to voicemail. When she still hadn't shown up by midnight, I was starting to get panicked. I'd called a few friends, but no one had heard from her. I decided to get a few hours of sleep and then figure out what to do in the morning. I laid down, turned out the lights, and was falling asleep when I heard a slight noise in the hallway. I opened my eyes to see Jenny in the doorway. "Where have you been?" I started, turning on the lights, but my voice died in my throat. It wasn't Jenny. It was Albert, hanging from the doorway of my room, swaying slightly back and forth above his shoes. The knife was back in his hand. My heart was hammering. This was obviously just Jenny taking the joke too far. But when I called out for her again and she didn't answer, my fear spiked. I took those clothes down, carried them downstairs, and even though I knew it was totally illogical, I burned them in the fireplace. I expected Jenny to come out and laugh at me once I got the fire going, or at least to chide me for stinking up the house. I don't know what they pack snow pants with, but it smells terrible when you burn it. But the fire burned down to ashes, and I was still alone. I slept for a bit, and when I left for work this morning, there was still no sign of Jenny, and she still wasn't answering her phone. I called the police to report her missing, and they're supposed to be sending someone over to take a look around and interview me, I guess. I hope they get here soon, because I just heard a noise from upstairs, and when I went to look, the door to our walk-in closet was standing open. Hanging from the bars, and lined in 2 neat rows, were a dozen of Jenny's outfits. Shirts still on the hangers, pants clipped below, shoes lined up underneath. The bedroom door only locks from the inside, but I closed it and used my tie to tie the knob to the banister in the hallway. I was going to leave the house, but there's a coat rack by the door, and I really don't think I lined up my shoes underneath it like that when I got home. I hope the police get here soon. I've been a national park ranger for close to 2 decades. Protocols have changed a lot in that time. I write this just to try to keep people safe for the next time you venture to the big outdoors. let me tell you about the last park I worked. I can't be too specific about the location for my job's sake. Anyway, we had clusters of campsites that we rotated annually. The idea was to prevent one group from getting overused and worn down, let nature regrow a little bit. The winter had just passed, and our big summer season was a few months away. I'm sent out to check the sustainability of the campsites to decide which ones need time to recover and which ones we can open up. Winters here are cold. Not too many people camp during the winter, aside from rugged masochists and Boy Scout troops led by people who believe they are rugged masochists. I didn't expect to find much out of the ordinary. The first site was clear and ready to go. As I'm trekking to the next site, I see what looks like some debris and junk down away in the river valley. Looks like some jackasses set up an unauthorized camp down there. Usually when that happens, they leave garbage and smouldering fires. This is going to be a pain to clear up. I approach, seeing the telltale wreckage of what must have been one hell of a party. Stuff scattered everywhere, the skeletons of tents still raised up, and blood. I stop, and time stops with me. Pools of blood are spread out along the ground, next to signs of something heavy being dragged into the brush. I pull my radio off my belt and pause. Then I pull my Glock 22 out of my holster and rack one round. I'm a certified law enforcement officer, but I haven't had to use my gun in a long time. I quickly look around for any movement, then get on my radio and call in for backup. While I wait, I listen. Silence. Silence in nature isn't good. Prey get quiet when they sense a predator. I hope all the birds are being still on my account. I edge forward slowly, looking for anyone or anything. A shredded plastic cooler, a tent that has been annihilated with more blood splashed on the walls and inside. People died here. I know it. You can't lose that much blood and just walk off. But no people. Shreds of clothes and a little viscera drawing all the goddamn flies here. But no people. I've seen bears rummage through camps and destroy anything that looked edible. There are wild hogs here that cut trails through the deep brush and are even more dangerous than the bears. But this isn't either of them. The devastation here is just too much. Some scourge of God came through here and just ripped everything to pieces. Finally, backup arrives, and I'm sent to report to HQ. They even brought medics out here. I don't know why. There's no one here to save. One of the new recruits vomits at the scene. I'm glad to get the hell out of here. I get back, and HQ is abuzz. Only 4 people work here, but calls are ringing, printers printing, and the air feels electrified. The manager sees me and signals me to his office. He's pale, ashen looking with bloodshot eyes. I sit down by his desk, and he goes to the door and locks it. I've never seen him lock that door. He asks me what I saw. I tell him, uninterrupted. He looks even paler afterward, and his hands tremble a little. There's a very long pause, and I expect more questions. He doesn't ask any. I leave, then hear the door lock behind me. After a few minutes, I hear him call someone up, and a long, low conversation ensues. I never see him again. Word comes down from on high. We're assigned a new manager, one who excels at what he calls crisis. His first order of business, a controlled burn of the unauthorized camp and the sites closest to it. I'm not arguing. I watch the smoke rise in the distance, then pray that's the end of it. New orders. Relocate the existing campsites closer to HQ. Before we do that, we stake out a few trail cameras at the new locations just to make sure it's not in the middle of some nesting ground. We put up a few cameras pointed at the hog trails through the brush for good measure. A couple of days pass, and we go out to collect the footage. The new manager takes it all and starts studying it in his office. A couple hours into reviewing, he freaks out, starts screaming and yelling, gets on the phone, calling up the line, spitting more obscenities. He spends the rest of the day and that night in the office, calling up scientists and planners. Next morning, I show up for a meeting. Manager doesn't look like he slept. Massive changes afoot. He lays out our new plans, including massively bright lampposts circling the park border, as well as floodlights around the ranger station. Campsites need to be moved even closer in. Clear lines of sight from the light, if possible. I butt in, telling him that defeats the point of going camping if you're just going on a short walk through the grass, then setting up so close you can see the parking lot. He tells me to shut up, that it's just the start. The park now closes at sundown, sharp. Also, we're now required to have a long gun on our person at all times. Now, this isn't uncommon for rangers to carry an AR-15 or a Remington 870 shotgun going out in the deep woods. There are wild and rabid animals out there. The real concern are massive pot growers. These aren't your chill neighbours who hide a few plants behind the tomatoes. They run the spectrum, from large-scale suppliers who like their privacy and dislike law enforcement, to anti-government crazies who think we have no right over them, the true patriots. Both groups have a few common points. They tend to be well armed, they do not like lawmen, and they won't shy away from taking a pot shot at some dumb poor ranger who finds himself in their fields. Keep in mind Elliot Ness, Mr. I fought Al Capone and won, got scared off busting up Alpacan moonshiners because they constantly sniped at him in the foothills. They shoot to kill. Those are the reasons we keep big guns around. Not routine patrols. I drew the short straw and got the overnight shift. Manager tells me more changes to protocol will be listed when I return. Overnights used to be easy. Monitor the radios, bust up the parties if needed, check for poachers if they're operating nearby, make sure the forest doesn't burn down. I clock in and per instructions go to the gun cage. Things have changed. Our shotguns have new rifled barrels, so they can handle the solid slugs we've been issued. That's the kind of firepower you want to take down a charging bear. God forbid you ever need it. The AR-15s have been stepped up too. The old 15-round magazines have been replaced by 30-round ones. Someone even snuck us in hollow point rounds. Makes no goddamn sense. Shooting in the woods, you need full metal jacket ammo, so the rounds don't go wild when they touch a twig. Hollow points just exist to do more tissue damage. This is ridiculous. This is overkill. We're not in a war zone. We don't need this firepower. Next to the radio, there are new instructions. We're not allowed to directly respond to emergency calls. We can reply, figure out what the issue is, then we report to a new phone number I don't recognize. Time passes slowly tonight. I'm not even allowed to leave the building until sunup. A few uneventful nights pass. The new floodlights and lampposts are frying my eyes. It's so bright out there, a blind man could see. A week later, some kids roll into the lot. They grab their backpacks and start hiking up the ridge. I know what they're up to. No one has booked a campsite that night. Cheap young ones going on a campout that will be a raging party. I wait for the sundown to go, confirming they're not out for a day hike. I call my manager to report. He instructs me to call the new number. I report up to them now. A curt voice answers the phone. He asks my park, then pauses. He asks the issue. A bunch of kids on an unauthorized site. Do I go break it up? I can see their campsite out on the ridge right now. No, do not leave the building. Do not attempt communication. That is all. Report if there are any developments. Right after daybreak, the manager rides up. It's clearly early. Have you seen them? Did they leave? No, the car's still there. Let them rest. They're probably all hung over. He curses non-stop, then goes inside to make a call. I'm outside, looking up the ridge when he exits the station. One AR-15 in his hand, another one strapped across his back, Glock on his hip. He marches single-mindedly toward his car. I ask him what in God's name he is doing, but he isn't listening or responding. He takes a jerry can of gasoline from his car and marches up the ridge. I yell after him, to no reply. I consider following him, but that doesn't seem like a good idea. I go back inside and call the number. The same curt voice, the same direct questions. Yeah, the manager just went up to the campsite armed to the teeth and carrying gasoline. What the hell do I do? Stay there. Do not interfere. Backup is inbound. Report if there are any developments. About the same time, I start to see smoke wafting off the ridge. 2 vans ride into the lot at a screeching speed. A dozen men, heavily armed and armored, exit quickly. I go out to check. Who are you guys? What's going on? The men are all lined up with that impeccable military precision. One of them, a commander, I assume, exits the vehicle last. He says, "Which direction did he go?" "I mean, he's up there." I point at the increasing smoke. The men fan out and start jogging up the ridge. I hear rifles cocking as they leave. I try to shout after them, but no response. I look at the van they came in. Large, nondescript. They just say DOI response team on the side. Half an hour later, they return, dragging the manager with them. He is bound in zip ties. He screams, "I did what needed to be done. Trust me, it's worse than they thought. We can't stop this. Burn it all." They throw him into the back and sedate him. The commander approaches me. My neck hairs bristle in cold fear. "I need to see the office. All computers and anything with a hard drive is coming with me." He mentioned videotapes. I need those too. I unlock the door and they ransack the place. Everything gets taken. Printed reports from the last few years disappear into those vans. The videotapes get bagged up and held by the commander himself. He studies the gun cage. "Cute. You're out of your league," he scoffs. Finally, they found everything they looked for. The commander tells me, "Call the number. Tell him it's contained. You need a new supervisor. Also, don't talk about this to anyone." They leave, and just on cue, the fire brigade and a few news vans show up. The fire is contained, the news reports say. Rumors of missing campers are unsubstantiated at this time. Still, the rumors alone are enough to scare off this season's campers. The quick change-up of managers is chalked up to bureaucracy. The press dies down after a week or two. The new manager is very good at dealing with them. Thankfully, with no new campers and our now even shorter open hours, we can get more work done around here. Rebuilding the station took some time. and we just set up the new campsites. They're practically spitting distance from the station. Nothing dramatic happens for a few days. Then, on a whim, the manager tells us to set up some cameras around the station and the campsites. There's usually so much human activity around here, all you see are some raccoons, maybe the rare, hungry bear, but we humour him and set them up all around. A couple of days pass, we collect the footage. I play poker with one of the rookies while the manager watches hours of footage of an empty but brilliantly illuminated parking lot. Then he gets to the footage around the station. Screams come from the office. We barge in and he's stamping on the camera hard drives, gibbering things I can't understand, along the lines of, "Told me it was clean, safe, no recent activity here. Bullcrap here. I'm not gonna do it." He barks at us to leave. Later, he makes a call. Rocky goes up to the door and listens in. Rocky comes reporting back. "Yeah, he's demanding a transfer. Says they lied to him. Something about they didn't do their jobs properly. He's not prepared or equipped here." Then I just heard the phone click and some sobbing. Hours later, my manager exits the office. His shoulders are slumped, defeated. We cut our hours even further, practically open on weekends only. We'll have a full staff ready those hours, but a skeleton crew the rest of the time. Campers are required to check in to one of the closest sites, no campsite, and they're told to leave. We're not authorized to leave the station after dark under any circumstances. In an emergency, do not call 911. Call the number and do exactly what they say. We draw straws for who gets the overnight shifts. Why we need to stay overnight if we can't do anything is beyond me. I asked the manager about it, and he just said that standard protocol is to have someone on hand to report any irregularities overnight. I have to work my overnight shift. I keep my phone close, the number dialed in, ready if I need to call. It is a bad night. I just wind up pacing around with my shotgun, glancing into the bright floodlights, trying to see what's past them. I hear crickets, and it relaxes me. Prey is quiet when predators are around. It's a long night. The next night, my manager draws the short straw. He seems resigned. In the end, we all have to take a turn. He brings the brightest damn tactical flashlight I've ever seen. Said he bought it just because he's afraid of the dark. He isn't really. He's afraid of the things in the dark. I get a phone call at 3 a.m. It's him. "Get over here now and bring guns." "What? You have a damn arsenal." "Now." "Oh, I swear to God, I screwed up. Oh man, I think they're attracted to the light. I called that number and all they said was backup would be here in the morning. Oh, damn, god damn." I hear the piercing staccato of gunshots. A pause. More gunshots. Screaming, scuffling. The line goes dead. I call the number. A new terse voice answers. "Look, I work at the park. I just got off the phone with the manager." "I just spoke with the manager. What can you report?" "Something bad happened. It's serious. I heard gunshots." "We will have backup there as soon as possible." "Did he say anything else?" "Yeah, he said he thought they were attracted to the light. Doesn't make sense to me." "Interesting. Thank you for your report. The park is now closed. You will be reassigned. Goodbye." Click. Officially, the park was closed to be rescheduled for a controlled burn. Let the old trees die and make room for the new ones. There was nothing in the official report about what happened to the manager on duty. The public understanding was bureaucracies needed to be shaken up on occasion. No one asked any more questions. I get transferred to a new park, halfway across the country. Change of scenery and beautiful. They've got some odd rules here too. Don't go far after dark, and don't carry a flashlight. I'm concerned about why. Why can't you use a flashlight at night when you need one? They won't tell me. Be safe, everyone. Downward spiral. I didn't even notice I was in hell my first year. Every day seemed the same, minus one particular detail. Nothing good happened, ever. I had a secure job, relationship, and life. It fell apart. All of those little doubts I had about myself ate away at me until they were full-blown paranoia. Then it became reality. My company kept suffering loss after loss until the problems were eventually pinpointed to being solely my fault. After I lost my job, I lost my fiancée to my best friend, and no one seemed to be on my side. Every person in my life was cold and distant. Even the little things that didn't matter were awful. Food always tasted terrible. My favorite shows were cancelled, and something in my apartment always needed to be repaired. Each day was cold with rainy overcast, and the nights were eerily dark, with no stars or moonlight. There is absolutely no enjoyment in hell, but the first year is child's play compared to the rest. Silence. During the second year, I came to two possible conclusions. The first was that I had gone completely insane, and the second was that I was no longer in the same world I was born into. It started in the morning when I powered up the TV. The morning news was on, but I couldn't hear anything. I turned the volume up to max. Still nothing. I set the remote down, and I couldn't even hear it hit the table. I started to panic, and immediately assumed I lost my hearing. I spoke aloud, but I was able to hear my voice just fine. I walked down to the corner store. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked directly at me. Everything froze, like time was standing still. My stomach turned. A sea of people stared in my direction, but their faces were a jumble of features. Eyes, noses, and mouths, all swirled in a mess of flesh, hair, and teeth. Even if I wanted to speak to one of these monstrosities, I couldn't. They remained still. Dead silence was everywhere I went, and every person stopped and turned in my direction, always watching my every move with their misplaced eyeballs. Hell was studying me, and it only got worse. Seclusion. If you've ever wished you could be in complete seclusion, I'll be the first to tell you it's not worth it. One day, out of nowhere, I was completely alone. No jumble-faced people, animals, cars, or life in general. The world was a hollow reminder of what used to be. With no plans in mind, I started wandering. The depression started to wear on me. Always alone. I had no idea what was going on or where I was. Eventually, it was too much, and the loneliness weighed down on me. I gave up. I jumped off the tallest building I could find. I felt the entire impact of the fall. I heard my bones shatter, but death never came. After 3 agonizing days of lying on the cold, black asphalt, the excruciating pain started to fade, and my body remained intact, even though it should have been completely mangled. Shadows. The suicide attempt seemed to accelerate things, but I was awarded with one luxury, and I use that term lightly. I could hear sounds again. It wasn't worth much in an empty world, but nevertheless, it had returned. But like everything in hell, there was a reason. My hearing allowed the shadows to terrify me on unimaginable levels. I'm not really sure what these things are, but I can try my best to describe them. You know that feeling when you're walking in a dark room or going down a flight of stairs in a creepy basement? The feeling that something is right behind you, so you start moving a little faster to get to the light? Multiply that fear by 100. I would catch glimpses of them out of the corner of my eye. Tall, black, humanoid figures darting quickly behind buildings or trees. I could feel them getting closer. The creeping paranoia consumed me. One night, I was taking a shortcut through an apartment complex. The entrance doors were open, and a flickering fluorescent light partially illuminated the narrow ground floor hallway. Halfway down the corridor, the lights went out, and darkness washed over me. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up, and I had the unmistakable feeling of something behind me. I prepared to run, but it was too late. With a high-pitched howl, one of the shadows had me. Its cold, dead hands wrapped around my arms as it sank its teeth into the top of my skull. The pain was indescribable. I thrashed around in agony as more shadows emerged from the open apartment doors. In my fit of pain and terror, I pulled my head free from the fangs and stumbled to my feet. I ran for what seemed like hours. I learned quickly that traveling in the evening was no longer an option. I barricaded myself in any shelter I could find every night. The shadows always paced around my doors until they would leave each morning as the dull, grey, cloud-covered sunlight drove them off. Abyss. Eventually, my nomadic lifestyle was impossible to continue. I unlocked the door of the small 2-bedroom house I had been sleeping in and walked outside. It was raining. It was always raining. Despite all that I'd been through, what I saw took me by complete surprise. The first change was the gates. Black iron bars had surrounded the neighborhood. They extended from the ground and rose impossibly into the sky. I was trapped. The second thing I saw were the jumble-faced people. They had returned. Dozens of them were lined up on the street in perfectly straight rows. They were different though. In groups of 4, dressed in black robes, they walked hand in hand towards a massive, swimming pool-sized hole in the ground. Without hesitation, a group of 4 will fall in, and after a few seconds, the next group would follow suit. I turned around to head back inside the home, but I couldn't. The iron bars had somehow closed in and were just a few feet away. I looked back towards the people and saw the bars across the street had moved in closer as well. It was pushing me towards the hole. I panicked and grabbed the bars with both my hands and began to shake them. They didn't budge. I started running the entire perimeter, looking for any way out. The bars began to move, ripping through the earth and concrete, pushing me closer and closer to the dark abyss. By this time, the rows of people were gone. I planted my feet in the ground and began pushing with all my strength. The bars continued to force me closer to the endless hole, despite my efforts. After a few moments, it was too late. I was right on the edge. I remember clawing at the ground, begging for help. I accepted the inevitable fact that I was going to descend into the darkness. But just before I fell, a flash of light blinded me. Electric pain filled my chest. I woke up in an emergency room back on Earth. According to the paramedics, I was only dead for a few seconds. I began rambling about all that I had seen and been through. Nobody seemed to acknowledge or believe me. This story is not a lesson. I'm not telling you to change your life or be a better person. This is a warning. If nothing in your life is going well, it might not be coincidence. You may be in hell. I'm going to tell you about a town you should never go to. For your protection, I won't tell you the name or location, but I'll tell you this. If you ever think you might be in this town, get the hell out of there and don't look back. It happened some years ago. I was on my way to visit an uncle I'd never met, meandering around, trying to read a rather confusing map, when I ran out of gas. Stupid, I know, but I can never make heads or tails of those damn things. The dangers of hitchhiking were disconcerting, though there wasn't much choice, so I didn't bother fussing about it and started up the road. The midday sun was oppressive. My forehead ached from all the squinting, and my clothes were soaking up a gallon of sweat. My tired arm hung lower and lower, as did my hope of hitchhiking a ride. But in the distance came into view a red pickup truck. "Please stop! Please stop!" I repeated, sticking my thumb out as far as it would go. As the truck grew closer, I waved my arms around until it eventually slowed down and stopped in the road. "That your car back there?" asked the friendly old coot from behind the wheel. "Yes, sir, I ran out of gas." "Hop in, we'll get you some at the next stop." Cappy. What a nice guy he was. He sure liked to talk about his family, but they were entertaining stories. His son was fighting overseas, and I could tell his kindness was inspired by the admiration he felt for my generation. Heroes, he called us. You wouldn't catch me on the front lines, though. Always been one to shy away from danger. I didn't tell Cappy that. Didn't want to disappoint him. After some time, I started to wonder when this town would show up, and I expressed my concern that it might be too far away. It didn't seem to bother Cappy. I guess he had nothing better to do. Still never found out where he was headed. The road was getting bumpy, then turned into two brown strips with grass down the middle. I could finally see a town peeking over the wild fields. Pitiful, yet quaint. It was textbook small-town America. Faded blue houses with white trim, A few brick and mortar businesses with hand-painted signs, town square, big red barn, white chapel on a hill. Cars were parked here and there, some without tires, though I didn't see any people around it. It wasn't surprising for such a remote hamlet. But what did surprise me was that, despite the barn, I didn't see any animals. There was no official fueling station, but we found an old garage with a gas pump out front. Cappy kept apologizing for lending his gas can to a neighbor while we searched through the cluttered garage. A rancid odor would come and go, making me sicker each time. "I'd better go find someone," I said, "and tell them what we're doing so they don't think we're robbing the place." Really, I just wanted to get away from that smell. "Look for a gas can in case I can't find one." "Roger that." The town seemed deserted, but I could hear voices echoing from somewhere, so I followed them. 2 children appeared from the tall grass, chasing each other down the road. In the distance was an apple orchard with kids running to and fro, tossing apples at each other, some of them on all fours. As I approached, laughter and playful screams came from all sides. It seemed like a normal child behavior, but then I noticed they were all wearing dog masks. There were a few children sitting at a pint-sized picnic table, playing with something that looked like cake, smushing it in their hands and smearing it on their clothes. I assumed from the cake, the masks, and the occasional party favors that there was a birthday party going on. Trying to seem as non-threatening as possible, I strolled over and attempted to question them. "I'm sure someone baked that cake to be eaten, not played with," I said, trying to sound like an authoritative parent. The children stopped what they were doing and looked up at me. I got the shivers. The way they all turned their heads at the exact same moment, all wearing those dog masks. And these weren't cute cartoon dog masks. The attempt at realism lent them a disturbing quality. "I'm sorry, but could you nice children take off those masks for a minute?" The kids looked at each other, then back at me. I started to feel embarrassed. "So, whose birthday is it?" One of the children made a little yipping noise. "Oh, it's you." Another child mimicked the other. "Then it's you? Is it your birthday?" A third child joined in. "Maybe it's all your birthdays." They didn't seem to be listening and continued to imitate puppies. Finally, I got a little testy. All that walking in the heat had already worn me down, and now these kids were poking at a beehive. "You listen here. What would your parents say if they saw you being so rude? Why don't you take off those masks and act like children, not dogs?" The kids started to yip louder, then transitioned to woofs, followed by short barks. "Stop that! Where are your parents? I have car trouble and I need an adult right away." The children didn't heed my requests and instead threw cake in my face. It tasted horrible. In hindsight, I don't think it was cake. "Fine then, but when I find your parents, they're going to hear all about this." It was like they didn't even know what I was saying. I turned to leave, but all the children that had been there, frolicking, were now standing side by side, blocking my way. Instead of telling them to move, I simply walked to the left in an attempt to go around them. But as I went one way, so did they. And as I went the other way, so did they. Cut it out! I didn't want to push them. They were just kids. "I'll give you brats to the count of 3 to move, or else I'm going to walk right through you." The children stood there and said nothing. There must have been more than a dozen, gaping at them in all those masks. It was so surreal. No two masks were alike. Each one was a different breed of dog, with expressions ranging from docile to enraged. As I started counting 3, a few of the children began making faint, low grumbling noises. I continued to count down 2, and more children joined in with the nasty growls. I gave a heavy sigh, knowing they weren't going to move. All right then, 1. All at once, the children began barking loudly. I was startled by how ferocious and angry they sounded. Stop that, I commanded, but they only barked louder. One of them chucked a rotten apple at me. It hurt. The other kids followed suit, and soon I fell victim to the spoiled fruit version of an old-fashioned stoning. I started to yell, "Wait till I find your parents," but took an apple to the face before I could finish. A few kids pushed me while I was distracted, and I lost my balance. They all rushed me, kicking and scratching. That does it. I was done fooling around. What the hell is wrong with you kids? I yelled, shoving them one by one to the ground. But they remained unfazed, continuing to kick and scratch and make those irritating noises. The cacophonous howl and fierce barks made my blood boil. I started striking the children, not caring about their safety or what their parents would do in retaliation. After realizing what I had done, I ran off to find Cappy. The children chased me into town. They were just kids, but I was spooked as all hell. The masks, the noises, they didn't even stop when I hit them. I caught sight of Cappy's truck, but I didn't see him. The children were gaining on me as I tripped and fell. Again, I was surrounded by those violent brats. I tried to get up, but there were too many kids on me, and my cries for help brought no assistance. Take off those goddamn masks, I hollered, attempting to pull one off. It was tied on tight. The barking turned to laughing, and I feared there might be other adults watching, mocking me instead of shooing away their insane offspring. My anger was just reaching its threshold when the children suddenly stopped attacking. They all turned their heads in the same direction and ran off together, howling and cheering joyfully. I stumbled to my feet, inspecting myself for scrapes and bruises. Cappy? I shouted, looking all around. My voice echoed for miles. The children were out of sight, so I ran back towards the truck, hoping to find him still searching the garage. I stopped at the general store first to see if anyone could help us, but no one was inside. They didn't seem to be in business. Shelves were mostly empty and caked with dust. I checked in the back. Nobody there. Then I heard some kind of uproar coming from outside. I peered out the window, but didn't see anyone. So I opened the door a little and turned my ear. I was sure something was going on with those kids. The only noise in the whole town was coming from that one direction. Part of me knew I should go back to the garage, but I wanted to see if the children were being scolded for their behavior. I followed the echoes until I clearly heard a guttural, anguished scream. The screaming continued as I banged on the nearest front door. Hey, is anybody home? Please. I jiggled the knob aggressively. Locked. There was another house about 30 yards away, so I banged on their door as well. Still, no one home. Or they just weren't answering. I circled the house, pounding on the windows, but it was no use. I had to make a decision. What would a hero do? I asked myself, and hurried towards uncertainty. The commotion was coming from a farmhouse at the bottom of a hill near the orchard. I ran so fast I nearly fell head over heels, though I hesitated when I got to the house. The door was wide open, and there were dog masks on the ground. I needed to know what was happening, but I wasn't prepared to find out. I thought about yelling for help again, or for Cappy, but I couldn't make a sound. When the screaming died down a little, I crept up the porch steps and peeked in, but didn't see anyone inside. Masks littered the floor. God help me, I couldn't just leave. Where would I have gone without a vehicle? It's not like I could have hotwired Cappy's truck. I had to go in. My footsteps made the boards creak, but I knew they wouldn't drown out the ruckus. A trail of masks led me closer to the disgusting sounds, and through the dilapidated house to an open door leading down into the basement. A stench beyond foul almost knocked me over. Listening closely, I tried to identify what was happening. It was those kids for sure, growling, barking, whimpering, slobbering. Now and then, a gurgly, desperate moan of agony would come through. I didn't want to go down there, but I had to see it with my own eyes. Crouching a bit, I crept from one wet, sticky step to another. A single light bulb illuminated most of the room, but didn't quite reach the stairs, so I knew I'd be hidden in the darkness. The floor was covered in muck that sloshed around as a few of the children scampered through it, tossing handfuls of it at each other. Most were gathered in the center underneath the light. It seemed like they were eating something, or feeding rather. I watched in disgust as the children tore at the meat, blood dripping down their chins and squirting on their faces. And oh God, their faces. How can you have an underbite and an overbite at the same time? The turned-up noses and far-apart eyes. It was hideous. Beyond that, they all had various facial deformities, of which I'm not equipped to describe. The laughter was almost more horrifying than anything because it meant they were having fun. I say this because I knew what they were eating. I just knew. I couldn't see what was left of his face, and his clothes were ripped to shreds. But I knew. I knew they were eating Cappy. I covered my mouth and tried not to scream or retch. Gagged a few times, but I didn't draw attention. My body tensed up so bad I could hardly move. But I willed it to inch backwards up the stairs, through the kitchen and the front door. I prayed to God those kids wouldn't follow. I assumed I was free once I reached the door, but the most gruesome fellow was standing there at the bottom of the porch steps. He wore a ghastly beard and a toothless, smug grin. His frame was massive, and I could smell him from 9 yards away. At first, we just glared at each other. I swear he had a wooden eye. I expected him to lunge at me. Instead, he pulled a small whistle from the front of his overalls. He pressed it to his lips and seemed to blow into it, but there was no sound. Sobbing and stumbling, I ran from house to house, banging on every door. The joyful roars of the children were drawing closer. so I took refuge in the store. They raced all around like it was a game of hide and seek, while I barricaded myself in the back room, waiting for those monsters to give up the search. The front door rattled a few times, and I suddenly realized I was a sitting duck in there if that big guy broke in. I still don't know why he never came after me. Eventually, the voices and footsteps faded away, and the town fell silent once more. Night came, and the children could be heard howling in the distance. I wondered if they knew where I was, and was simply waiting until I came out to terrorize me. I thought of poor Cappy, and how delighted he was to help a total stranger. He didn't deserve to die in such a grisly manner. I wanted to find that gas can now more than ever. Not so I could escape, but so I could burn that house down. Hell, I wanted to burn the whole damn town. The howling passed, so I snuck out the back door and crawled on my belly to the woods, planning to wait for sunup, then hiking to a main road. There were no lights on in the town as I spied from the trees. I was worried the children might go wandering at night, but I'd never find my way back in the dark. A single silhouette could just barely be seen coming closer, and I could hear the rustling of the weeds. It was one of those savages. I hesitated to run, fearing they'd hear me and alert the others. There were a few rocks of substantial weight near my feet, so I picked one up and held it tight. I listened as the child snatched up an animal that leapt from the brush. As they gnawed at the poor creature, I moved in. They snarled and growled as they ate, masking the crinkles of dead leaves beneath my feet. I held my breath, stepping into arm's length while slowly lifting the rock over my head. Over and over, I bashed that child's head beyond recognition. I never thought I could do that to a child, especially with such abandon. But I didn't do it so much for my own safety as I did it for Cappy. The sun began to rise, and I observed the boy's body. When I saw him lying all limp on the ground, head caved in and bloody, I regretted what I'd done. Sure, I wasn't a damned cannibal, but I felt like I'd stooped to their level. I murdered a child, and I can never take that back. Bits of laughter echoed from the town. Startled, I ran off in the wrong direction. Tired and hungry, I trudged through the fields and over hillsides until the sun was directly overhead. Now and then, I'd hear the faint sound of an engine, though I couldn't find a road. The weight of everything that had happened made it difficult to go on, but that weight lifted a bit when a ranch came into view on the horizon. As I approached, the unwelcome sound of children playing echoed across the meadow. A few were galloping here and there, making strange noises. It seemed like normal child behavior, but then I noticed they were all wearing horse masks. I should have been studying, but instead I was browsing a heap of websites to check for the various Black Friday sales. If there was a time to spend a heap of money on things I didn't need, it was this weekend. On top of that, I was keeping an eye out on potential items for Christmas. My guilt of all the overworked retail staff and delivery drivers outweighed my avarice for cheap goods. I was fully relaxed. Usually, my family were all doing their separate things and distracted me from whatever I did for fun on the family computer. But this time, it was all mine. and I was happily alone. Around me were various oven-cooked quick meals and a heap of snacks usually reserved for the family's movie nights. I was in charge of watching the house while my parents were away, so I took raiding the kitchen as payment for my amazing service. My job was simple. Make it look like the house was occupied while the family were gone. There had been a string of suspicious behaviors reported around my neighborhood, so my parents wanted to be extra careful. Because I was doing the unhealthy habit of sitting in the dark, staring at a brightly lit screen, it was very noticeable when another light entered the room. I turned to see the curtains to the front window glowing. This meant one thing. The motion detector out front had picked up movement. I turned back, knowing my neighborhood had a number of dog owners, including the neighbor next door, Gary, who usually cut across our yard rather than weave around his flower arrangements. An annoying habit, but one we got used to. I turned back and returned to scrolling through the many sales pages of Amazon when the glow clicked off. However, not long after, it came back to life. This made me pay more attention, trying to read into the details. When a dog walker strolled past, it usually only set off the detector once. If it went off a second time, this meant one thing in my head. The dog was going to poop on the yard. I hated this, as this usually ended up as my job to sort out, as the rest of the family were squeamish at the thought. An excuse I could never prove was false. I took this as my chance to catch whoever did this in the act, so I briskly made my way to the window, ready to peek at the culprit. As I pulled the curtain aside, I was taken aback at how different the scene in my front yard looked compared to how I'd imagined it. There was no dog in the yard, but there was still something which seemed to be setting off the sensor. It was a person. A tall, adult figure standing ominously in the middle of the yard, barely illuminated and teetering on the edge of the motion light sensor. I stared for a bit, wondering what was going on. I wanted to call out and see if they needed help, but I was too irrationally unnerved to get their attention. I settled on just slowly dropping the curtain and getting back to my computer, hoping they thought the place was vacant. As I stood there behind the closed curtain, the light soon dimmed out, and I took this as my cue to leave. However, as I turned, the light soon burst to life, once more lighting up the window. This time though, I jumped back and let out an audible yelp as I did so. My heart raced and my eyes widened as adrenaline shot through me. Something was different this time. Rather than the light simply lighting up the whole window in a dulled glow through the entire curtain, there was a dark spot. In the middle of the curtain was the silhouette of a person, very close to the glass, looking like they were trying to stare in. And there was no way they weren't aware I was in there. In a flight or fight response, I burst to the front door to check if it was locked, and to my relief, it was. I added the latch to be extra careful and used this safety to be more cautious. My next immediate reaction was to call the police. There was no way I wanted to handle this situation by myself, so I patted down my pockets, to which I remembered there were none. Thanks to the pajama bottoms I stole from my girlfriend, I had no pockets, which usually meant I left my unattended phone on the computer table. I carefully meandered back to the living room PC, but I barely got partway across the room when I stopped, dead in my tracks. The light from my brightly lit PC monitor was casting a shadow I knew it shouldn't. It was the long shadow of a person standing in the living room. The fear set in that the figure had already gotten inside. Out of reflex, I flicked my head around back to the front window, and confusion set in. The silhouette from before was still there, standing eerily still in front of the illuminated window's curtain. I jumped again at the sight of this, since I wasn't expecting it that time around, and sadly, my reaction made a sound. I heard another sound in response, and turned to see the figure in the living room react, and started heading in my direction. I gave up any semblance of stealth and ran to the front door, screaming at the person in the house to stop. Whether these two figures were working together or not wasn't my concern in that moment. All I thought was that I felt trapped in my house, and in my head, I had a better chance in the open outside world than confined in a small house. While unlocking the door, the person in the house started screaming back. He screamed at me to stand still and to stop. It was naive of him to think I would listen. This only made me move faster, knowing the only way to survive would be to do the opposite of what he wanted. I managed to fumble the front door open and ran into the darkness outside, the motion light seeming to have clicked off while I was messing with the front door lock. I took a chance and ran to the tall figure outside, now standing back in the middle of the grass, once a source of fear, now a beacon of hope. If there was a suspicious person entering my house, then this person was someone who might have been trying to warn me. I got right up to him and turned back to the front door, now feeling a bit more secure, knowing I was with someone. The abnormally slow motion light finally reacted to my movements and flashed on, hitting me in the eyes. When my eyes adjusted, I realized who I was squinting at. Standing in the front door was my neighbor, Gary, whom my parents gave a back door key to in case of emergency. He screamed at me over and over a late warning to stay away from the figure outside my house. My heart sank deep into the pit of my stomach, bile rising in my throat. Not just from the panic of realization setting in, but the rotting smell emanating from the figure beside me. I dared not look up at its face, but seeing the twisted, rotting skin on its hand by its side was enough to paint the picture that I'd made a horrible mistake. I took one last glance at Gary to see how he was going to help me. He just mouthed he's sorry and closed the front door. After I heard the front latch click, I picked up on a slight movement, the sounds of a head turning and looking down in my direction. I just carried on, staring forward in denial, my view of the front door blurring with teary eyes. I always enjoyed my Sunday visits with Grandpa. He wasn't able to take care of himself anymore, so the family had moved him into a retirement community. Being an independent person, Grandpa had made a big fuss about moving in at first. However, once he started to get to know the other residents and learned about all of the activities that went on in the home, he felt a little better about being there. After Grandpa moved in, I would visit him every Sunday and join him in the weekly game challenge. The game changed depending on the week. Sometimes it would be gin rummy, other times it was shuffleboard, sometimes it was bingo. The games were chosen ahead of time by the residents from a list that had all of the games available written on it. When the game was decided upon, the entire hall would be converted into an arena for the game of choice. This week, the residents had chosen to play backgammon. Admittedly, not one of my favourites. After we played a few rounds of the weekly game, Grandpa and I would get some lunch from the retirement home dining hall and then head back to his room so he could tell me all of his favourite stories. Grandpa told all sorts of stories about gnomes, fairies, giants, and other supernatural creatures. He even told me about the urban legends, like the alligators living under the sewer he had heard while growing up in New Jersey. It was always great fun hearing Grandpa's stories, and I always looked forward to hearing a new one every week. The years passed, and I entered high school. I didn't stop by to visit Grandpa as often anymore, because I became busy with hanging out with friends, doing homework, and starting to date girls for the first time. Even though I didn't have the same amount of free time as when I was younger, I would still try to visit Grandpa as often as I could and join in on the Sunday games. I would have lunch with Grandpa and listen to one of his tall tales when we went back to his room. I was older, but I still loved listening to his stories. It seemed like he would never run out of subjects to talk about. He even told me about his experiences as a pilot in World War II. It was always great fun listening to the trouble he got in as a pilot, flying under billboards to see how low he could make his personal plane that he bought after the war go. Finally, it came time for me to go off to college. I would not be back for a while, so I wanted to spend a lot of time with Grandpa before I left. I noticed that his health had taken a turn for the worst, but he never brought it up. I never brought it up either, because I didn't like to think about the fact that Grandpa's health was fading. I visited him like usual, up until the last day I had free before the start of the new semester. This would turn out to be a visit that I would never forget. We had our usual schedule: play a game, chat over lunch about all of the new things in both of our lives, and go back to his room for a cup of coffee, butterscotch cookies, and one of his tall tales. We sat at the table next to one another, dunking our cookies into our hot coffee and eating them one by one. Today, Grandpa seemed more introverted than usual. He hadn't really said much over lunch either. I figured that this was because he was having one of his bad days, or the days when his bones ached and he had a hard time getting around. However, I didn't think this anymore when I saw Grandpa promptly stop eating the cookies in front of him and give me the most serious look I had ever seen him give me in his life. I put down my cookies as well and listened for whatever it was Grandpa was about to tell me. He cleared his throat and, in a grey tone, said, "You are older now, Thomas. You are about to go off to university and experience a whole new chapter in your life. That is why today I have to give you some advice." I smiled and urged for him to go on. Grandpa nodded and continued where he left off. "You are the first person I'm telling this to. I told myself I would only tell my most devoted grandchild a story in the hopes that they would not make the same mistake I did in life. And you must promise me that you will only tell this story to your most devoted grandchild, so that every generation is given a fair warning." Grandpa paused and made sure I was going to keep the promise. I swore that I would on my life, and then he continued on. "You know about your grandmother, don't you? You were only 5 or so when she passed away. At this, he paused when he saw my expression changed a bit. After patting my shoulder for a moment, he went on. Yes, I miss her too. I always loved her dearly. It is at my old age that I've had a lot of time to reflect on my past actions. I wish that when we were married, I could have treated her better. If I had treated her better, maybe she wouldn't have turned out like that. I was taken aback a bit by his statement. What do you mean? Grandpa sighed. This is what I wanted to talk to you about. Some advice I want to offer for you as you head off into the world and want to make a life for yourself. You see, your grandmother and I got married in the 50s. In those times, men were king of the house and their wives had to attend to their every need. I'm not saying it is right, it is just the way things were back then. I was the same as most men of that era. I was fresh out of the military service from World War II and had just settled down with your grandmother. We bought a cheap house under a government program to encourage home ownership, and I got a job working at an office. Unfortunately, like most men of the era, I was always very hard on your grandmother, who, like most women of that era, stayed at home. I always demanded the best from her, the best housework, the best meals, the best hosting when we had neighbors over. I insisted that she always dress up, wear makeup, and put on her fine jewelry when managing the house. No wife of mine was going to be a slob and get me mocked by the neighbors. Looking back now, I realize how silly I was to demand all of that of her. But I suppose we were both victims of the culture of that time. I think my strictness got to your grandmother at times, because there were occasions when I would see her weeping to herself as she made dinner in the kitchen. When she was like that, I would leave her alone. I had tried to suggest that we watch one of her shows on the Women's Network or listen to a cooking show on the radio, but my suggestions always just made her more upset, so I learned to give her space when she was in one of her moods. However, one night, she was so upset that she burned our meal. Even after burning it, she still served it in both of our dishes at the table and sat down to eat her own portion, still weeping as she shoveled the burnt pieces into her mouth. This was unacceptable to me. I chastised her for what she had done and told her to go back in the kitchen and make a new dinner for both of us. I told her if she couldn't get herself together to simply make me a sandwich, that ought to calm her down a bit. It was then that something changed in her. Her tears suddenly stopped and a small smile crept over her face. She laughed a bit and I laughed along too. The whole situation was a bit comical. I apologized for being strict and she shook the whole thing off. She brought the dishes back to the kitchen and set forth to making a second meal, which, when served for the second time, was up to her usual quality of cooking. After that incident, your grandmother didn't cry again. She went about happily doing the housework and preparing the meals. When she was chastised, she would just smile and say she'd do better. She was the model housewife. It was around that time when one of my good friends, Jerry, went missing. Your grandmother knew his wife, Edith, and together they got all of the housewives involved in trying to find him. They put up flyers and the like, but unfortunately, Jerry was not seen again. It was a few months later when another one of my friends, Stan, went missing. The housewives got together again and tried to find him with little success. After that, the excitement died down. Although the men were not found, no one else went missing from the neighborhood. It became somewhat of a local mystery. None of the men had a reason to go missing. They both worked at the same office that I did, and they both had stable home lives. Even to this day, the neighborhood is still talking about the circumstances surrounding their disappearances. The incident did bring the community closer together. The housewives ended up forming their own club, which became a national sorority. It was open for many years, and during that time donated a lot of its time helping less fortunate people in the community. I was one of the people who always wondered what happened to Jerry and Stan. They were good friends, and I was always sad to lose them. It was when your grandmother's health started failing many years later that we got to talking about my old-time friends. Here, my grandfather paused, as if the subject was hard to talk about. But when he saw my concerned expression, he continued on. Don't worry about me, lad. I'll be okay. Now, where was I? Oh yeah. Many years later, your grandmother and I were talking about Jerry and Stan. And that is when she brought up all of the great things she cooked while we were looking for them. The mouth-watering roast she had prepared and fed to all of the members of the search party. The roast beef sandwiches she had packed for the lunches I took to the office. The blood pudding she had made for the neighbors. She went on like this, naming off all of the different meats she had cured and served to people over the years. I recalled all of her meals with warmth, but was a bit confused to why she would have brought it up when I was talking about my old friends. And that is when the smile came over her face. That same smile that had come over her face at the dinner table those many years ago. An unsettling kind of grin that seemed to reach in and tug at my very soul. "They've already been cooked, dear," she said in a crackling, uneven tone. I felt myself retch a bit at the thought of consuming the terrible thing I had. Your grandmother just chuckled and continued on. "I cooked them along with all of the people you complained about at your job. Remember how you complained about Stan and Jerry getting promoted before you? I took care of that, did I? I made sure the supervisors who were bullying you moved away. Of course, they didn't really go anywhere other than my cooking pot. I always made sure to cook a perfect meal out of all the naysayers, just for you." Grandpa stopped his tale to retch a bit, and I stared at him with my mouth open. I could feel the colour draining from my face. At this point, I was visibly shaking. When he got a hold of himself, he continued on. "Shortly after, your mother told me she passed away peacefully in her sleep. That same creepy smile was painted on her lips when I found her. After her funeral came and went, her last words haunted me. I wanted to know more. I started reading through her old journals, and I learned that the women's club she had formed, the Jersey White Hat Club, had a very dark practice that they put into place. Should any man give them a hard time, it was not above them to punish him in any way possible. They outlined all of the ways they could punish their significant others, boyfriends, or other troublesome men in their lives. There were recipes for poisons, instructions on how to psychologically torture people. There were so many dark things I read in those journals that I don't even want to repeat them. One of their most twisted games was taking a friend of the troublesome men in their lives and serving it to him in the form of food. They had all sorts of recipes about cooking and preparing human beings. Those journals were some of the most horrible things I have ever read in my life. I would have burned them all if I didn't have to turn them into the police station for evidence. That's what I did instead. The police read the journals over in complete disbelief. I gave them the journals with the specific conditions of keeping my family out of the media and the investigations. I told them that was the only way I would hand over the evidence. Since I knew the head of the local police station, he pulled some strings and focused much of the investigation on the living members of the sorority, like your grandmother's best friend, Edith. They investigated the local Jersey White Hat Club and brought in all of the current members for questioning. Our family sat on the sidelines watching the whole thing in disbelief. As you know, Edith had been one of our close family friends for years. Everyone was shocked that she was actually a member of such a dark cult. If they knew everything that I do about your grandmother, they would have been more horrified. Fortunately, that was not a truth that any of them had to bear. Later, the police found out that every chapter of the sorority across the United States was still practicing the dark rituals written in your grandmother's journals. They were able to successfully shut down the sorority 2 years ago after being active for all those years. But I heard recently a new club started up under a different name. This is the advice I want to give you. If you meet a girl wearing a white opal stone shaped like a moon on her left ring finger, under no circumstances have any relationship with her. Report her and whatever club she's affiliated to the police. That is their secret calling card. And just to be safe. Here, Grandpa paused to take a drink of a glass of orange juice beside his coffee to calm his nerves, and then continued on. Never, I repeat never, mock a girl by asking her to make you a sandwich. Don't demand anything from her. Treat her equal. Let her do as she pleases. If I had learned to be kinder to your grandmother all of those years ago, I wouldn't have created the monster she became. Be kind to the ladies in your life, grandson. The consequences for doing otherwise are dire. And with this, Grandpa fell silent. His hands were wrapped around the glass with the orange juice for support, but they were visibly shaking. I was shaking too. All of this was too much to take in. I could only sit there, staring at my grandfather in silence. Every time words came to my mouth, they quickly left me. The two of us didn't talk for the rest of our visit. I simply got up from the table and walked to my car without another word when it was time to leave. The words of my grandfather's story echoed throughout my mind on the long drive home. 4 years after my visit, and shortly after I received my bachelor's degree, my grandfather passed away. I attended the funeral in the late spring. The whole family was there. My mother, my father, his 2 brothers, my cousins, my sister, and her husband. Of course, the more obscure family members were there too, like my grandfather's sisters, the cousins 3 or 4 times removed, and other assorted relatives. Your standard fare for the typical family gatherings. It was an open casket funeral, so the family could come up and look at him lying peacefully in his new home. I came up and paid my respects. I silently promised my father that I wouldn't tell what I knew to anyone in our family, and thanked him for all of the good times we shared. It was then that one of my female cousins came up and paid her respects to Grandpa too. She tried to lighten the mood a bit by teasing me about finding a girlfriend. I told her that I was in no hurry to find one, and she rolled her eyes. As she went to talk to the other family members, I got a sight of something white on her finger. My heart started beating loudly in my chest at the sight of it. It was an opal stone cut in the shape of a moon. She wore it on her left ring finger. My eyes shot around the rest of the room. My aunt wore the ring, My female cousins wore the ring. My grandfather's sisters wore it as well. Even my mother wore it. My head started spinning as I realized that all of the female members of the family wore the same ring. I felt my heart pounding louder and louder in my chest. My grandfather had made a big mistake not getting our family involved in the investigation. This thought washed over me as I saw more family members enter the funeral house wearing that infamous ring, and the walls felt more and more like they were closing in on me. A man came into my house last night. I'm the one who let him in, but I don't know how this happened or why. I know I would never let a stranger, someone whom I've never seen or heard of before, come into my home like that, especially at such a late hour. I am a sensible person, just as much as everyone else. And yet, I did let him in. There are some gaps in my memory, but I'll do my best to describe the events of last night. Maybe it'll help us get a better understanding of what happened, but something tells me it won't make a difference. I don't remember whether he knocked on the door or rang the doorbell, but then again there's also the possibility that he didn't do any of those things. I only recall standing in front of the door with my hand already on the doorknob, yet not quite sure how I got there in the first place or what even prompted me to get off the couch. I was just there, and all I can say is, somehow, I knew there was someone on the other side of the door and that they were waiting on the porch for me to let them in. I know I tried forming certain thoughts in my head, such as, what am I doing? Or, what's going on? But they always seemed to fizzle before completion. Instead, my actions and speech seemed to be under some kind of outside influence. My hand wouldn't let go of the doorknob, eager to twist it and finally let the stranger inside. I wanted to ask, "Who is it?" But the only thing I blurted out was, "Yes?" The man on the other side of the door replied immediately, as if on cue. "I'm here to see your house." There was a strange air of familiarity to his voice, and yet at the same time, there was a smothering, violently uncanny aspect to it. It sounded deep, yet distant, friendly, but intrusive. This immediately raised some flags, but any and all concerns I'd have would disappear just as quickly as they'd come. I wanted to say I'd be calling the police if he didn't leave, but I literally couldn't utter any of those words. I couldn't even say no. The more I tried to speak my mind, the more confused I'd become. The effort I was making was such that I could feel cold sweat forming all over my body. "Of course," were the words that came out of my mouth on their own. I can see him. I can visualize him in my mind. But as soon as I try picturing or describing any of his traits, I feel like something pushes me back. Something's preventing my own thoughts and memories of him from becoming fully formed, and that alone is simply too terrifying to comprehend. I remember opening the door. I remember thinking, he is very tall. I didn't even see his face immediately. what I saw was his chest. He was tall, very tall. He grabbed the top of my doorframe and slightly ducked underneath it as he walked into my home, before slowly closing the door behind him and locking it shut. My doorframe stands about 7 feet. I know because I'm the one who assembled it. I'm 6'1". He was tall, more than I'm able to say. And his face. I know I saw it, whether willingly or not, but I can't quite tell what was wrong with it, despite knowing fully well that there were many alarming things about it. No hair, very distinctive eyes and mouth. His skin, both its tone and texture, were just maybe a mask? Was it something sewn into the skin? I can't be sure, but there was something inherently revolting and dangerous about his face. That much I'm sure of. It made me feel this terrible uneasiness in the pit of my stomach, which was nothing but yet another thing that I couldn't voice or express, no matter how much I tried. He didn't have any kind of odor attached to him, but he exuded this absolutely impenetrable, unfathomable madness and incomprehensible dimensions. Christ, I don't even know what I'm trying to say here. This all sounds so insane. I don't know how long we stood in the entryway of my home, almost in absolute darkness if it weren't for the moonlight coming through the windows behind him. I know we stared at one another for a while, but I can no longer see his eyes. I remember only darkness. Dripping, oily, smeared darkness all around the corners of his eyes. "Show me where you eat," he asked. I found myself standing in the living room. The man had his back to me as he slowly ran his hand on the dining table, as if tracing an invisible line. I couldn't do anything but watch as I stood there, completely still, as an unseen force prevented me from moving. "This will do," he said. "It suits you," I replied, words once again coming out of my mouth without me having a say. "Show me where you sleep," he asked. Fear instantly tightened its grip inside my chest, not because I would be leading him shortly into my bedroom without being able to do a thing about it, but because my wife was sleeping on our bed. The mere thought of seeing this dark figure standing in our bedroom as she slept was simply too much to bear. But I was powerless. The next thing I recall is standing outside my bedroom. The door was wide open, and I could see the man inside as he slowly approached my wife's side of the bed while she slept under the blankets. He sat right next to her. The mattress creaked under his size and weight. My wife called out to me, and I could immediately tell she was terrified beyond words by the sound of her voice. I could tell that she, too, wasn't quite saying what she wanted to say. She wasn't moving or making any attempts to get out of bed, even in the presence of this terrifying stranger. We were both equally helpless. The man, perhaps sensing the concern we felt for one another, said to her, "Do not be upset. I came to see your house." As he said those words, His face drew closer to hers. I wanted to stop him. Entering the bedroom was all I was trying to do, but I found my hands gripping the sides of the doorframe, preventing me from taking a single step inside. Dark thoughts flashed through my mind, but when I heard him mumble some words, I realized he was merely whispering something into her ear. I say merely because he could have done anything he wanted to her at that point if he wanted to, and yet the words he spoke to her were just as bad as anything else. She started sobbing, slowly at first, and then uncontrollably, as if an unspeakable thing had been done to her. Sobs turned into screams, and screams became piercing shrieks. It was heartbreaking, and in my helplessness, I found myself thinking how I could just die then and there if I had the chance. I didn't understand anything anymore. Who was this man? What did he want? And what could he have possibly said to my wife to elicit such a reaction from her? I just wanted all of it to end. And that's when he turned his head to me and said, "Show me the children now." I felt like my heart got caught up in my throat. I had forgotten about my kids until he mentioned them. He stood in between their beds as my wife's violent shrieks could still be heard coming from down the hall, but my kids were somehow still asleep. The strange man stood tall before me, perfectly still. He would turn his head slightly to the right and then to the left as he observed each of my two daughters for what felt like a painfully long amount of time. "Good children," he whispered. He moved without a sound and stopped as he left their room to look at me in the eyes once more as we both stood out in the hallway. "Good flesh. This is a good house." His words made me snap back to reality. We were back at the entryway, but this time around, I was the one with my back to the door, not him. He laid the back of his hand softly on my shoulder, and its weight felt infinite. "You will now pass ownership of this house unto me." It's not so much what he said, but how he said it. There was a certain sense of complete and utter finality to that statement. I knew that if I gave him what he wanted, I wouldn't be forfeiting just my home, but a lot of other things as well. Maybe everything. I had to do something, and I still do not know how exactly I managed. There was no word for my sorry mental state at the time, so I don't think it was a conscious effort, at least not entirely. This man, he was after something. He seemed to want my house, which appeared to be good enough for him for reasons that were beyond me. But I could only say what he wanted to hear. "This is a good house," I repeated. There was a brief pause. "Yes," he said. "You deserve the best house," I continued. His face inched closer to mine as he bent over slightly. "Yes. There are better houses," I said. he stopped, abruptly, almost as if frozen in time for a few seconds. I remember his head producing a slight twitch, which would have gone unnoticed if he wasn't so damn close to me. "Down the road," I said, as I shot a look to the side. He straightened himself up, his eyes now fixated on a window behind me and what lay beyond. As he did, I found that it was getting easier for me to speak on my own terms, so I kept at it. Better houses, bigger families. His head slowly turned to face me once again, and I could tell he was trying to verify how factual my statements were. He walked past me and went over to the window where he stood in silence. I realized then that my wife wasn't screaming anymore. I heard him mumble something, but I couldn't quite make out what he was saying, except for the word "skin things." He then took a few steps back before approaching the door. "I will go see more houses." He unlocked the door and opened it. I couldn't believe he was actually leaving. "You can sleep for now." As he said those words, I felt a crushing wave of exhaustion suddenly coming over me. I fell to the ground, but barely registered anything as my body went numb. I saw this massive figure once again ducking under the doorframe as he stepped onto the porch. He said something else on his way out, but I wasn't able to make out what it was, nor did I care. I was just glad to see him gone. My wife startled me awake. As I realized where I had fallen asleep and the memories of the previous night slowly came back to me, I hoped that it had been nothing but a nightmare, coupled with a brief sleepwalking episode, even though nothing of the sort had ever happened to me in the past. It took just one look at her face to know that it had been real. All of it. She didn't remember seeing much, as she had never left the bed, but she remembered enough. The tall man, the indescribable terror, the words that wouldn't come out of the body that wouldn't move, his face. Our daughters, on the other hand, were seemingly oblivious to everything that transpired, so we did our best to not freak them out too much. We made sure they weren't hurt, but there was just no way we could send them off to school after what happened. We made up a lie and said the school would be closed for the day, maybe the whole week. My wife and I sat down and we both tried to figure out what the hell had happened. But we kept hitting the same mental barriers. We thought about calling the cops, but would we be taken seriously? We can barely describe the man, even though his image is forever burned in our minds. The more we try discussing it, the less it makes sense. But at least we agree on something. We are leaving today, and he won't find us here if he ever comes back. He can take this house and claim it as his own. I don't care, but that's as much as I'm willing to compromise. We will never go through this again, not if we can help it. Who knows what he'd do to us? It was an utterly normal day for me. Well, actually, I'd gotten a parking ticket and a jury summons, so it was a pretty bad day for me. However, neither of those would seem of any consequence when I got home at the end of it to find my computer infected. But maybe I'm going a little too fast. Let me take a step back and we'll start from when I returned from work that day. As always, the things I did was go through the mail. Feel free to imagine my aggravation at the summons here. It didn't help either that everything else was junk mail and bills. Whatever. Just one of life's many joys. Preferring to relax a bit before dealing with them, I went straight to my computer to do, well, nothing at all. Just some browsing, check my email, etc. Doing nothing can be good for the soul. I noticed my computer running much slower than usual though. Certainly slower than it was just yesterday. My first reaction was to look at my taskbar to see if my antivirus was updating, or maybe Windows was downloading new features or something. You know, the usual culprits. But alas, no such luck. I tried to put up with the slow speeds for a while, just wanting to get a level head before I had to deal with troubleshooting this thing. Yet another nuisance on this day that seemed so ripe for them. Eventually, my patience reached its limit though. My attempts to relax at the terminal having crashed and burned, I went to address this problem now, determined to find a way to wind down if it killed me. Upon opening the My Computer folder, a red flag raised. My hard drive had no free space left on it at all. To put things into perspective, I have a 1TB internal hard drive with almost nothing on it. I got this computer from a friend of mine, much techier than I, and while I don't know nearly as much about computers as she, I know that a terabyte is a lot of space, and that my entire computer didn't even use 10% of it yesterday. Clearly, something was going on, and I suspected some kind of virus or malware. I've heard there are some out there that will create garbage data on your system, flooding it with pointless files just to fill it up and make it run slow. I'd always wondered what possible benefit there could be in this, but my friend told me there are some scammers who will infect your computer with one of these viruses, then try charge you a fee to clean and speed up your PC. Fortunately, I hadn't received any such contact. Yet. Still, my suspicions seemed grounded. I gave up and performed a scan with my antivirus program. A full scan. Sure, one might think a quick scan would be faster, but if it didn't turn up anything and I was then forced to do a full scan afterwards, it would just wind up taking longer than if I went with a full scan from the start. Kind of a roundabout logic, but I just wanted to get this resolved so that I could finally just relax at my computer. I went to watch some TV for a while. Nothing good on. I really just wanted to go browsing. A couple hours later, I heard the little scan complete chime from my speakers and went to go examine the results. No viruses, no malware. I was baffled. However, there was one thing of note on the screen. One file could not be scanned due to corrupted data values. The window had three options: list, report, and dismiss. I clicked list to see the details of the file, and it showed a file that made up a bunch of square characters. Square.anima was the file name. This was no file that I put there, and I'm sure it wasn't there before. I'd never installed any kind of language extensions on my computer, so the file name was written in characters from some other language, maybe Japanese or Arabic or something. I'd also never heard of the .anima file type, but that could wait. The file location was listed in some secluded subfolder of System32. That's where viruses like to hide out, right? I made my way to the folder and examined the file. As expected, It read as an unknown file type. My computer didn't know what program would open it. Not that I had any plans of doing so just yet. Besides, what surprised me more was the file size, or rather, the lack of one. There was no file size listed. That is, it was just a garbled mess of text, if you could call it that. It looked like some sort of glitch, but maybe they were some kind of special characters. I'd seen people make signature art using what looked like garbled messes of text before. One of the first things I learned about computers was that a computer does what you tell it to, not what you want it to. That is, everything happens for a reason. Someone had to program this behavior, make it display like this. I didn't know what the file was, but I knew I didn't need it spamming up my system, as I was sure it was doing. So of course, having found the little bugger, I immediately deleted it. All the problems went away. I was able to browse in peace once again. The traffic ticket was overturned, and I managed to weasel out of my jury duty. That's what I'd like to say. Instead, a little Windows message popped up telling me that the file could not be deleted. Access was denied. There was no question at this point. Definitely some kind of virus. I tried and tried, but nothing I did was able to get rid of the bugger. After 4 attempts, the second window appeared over the usual "cannot delete" message. This one was formatted like a Windows message, except that there was no title in the top bar of the window, and there was only one word of text: "Stop." This was accompanied by 2 choices: yes or no. I considered my options, but knowing that this was a virus, and it wasn't willingly going to allow me to delete it, I chose yes. Thankfully, the window terminated as it should have, and I went back to the Explorer window. I decided to do some research, as I probably should have done before messing with that file at all in retrospect. Putting up with the incredibly slow browsing speed, I ran a search for the file name by copying the characters. When that turned up nothing, I just tried to search for the .anima file type, which I'd never heard of. No results. Maybe this was some brand new kind of virus. Maybe the antivirus software hadn't found a way to recognize it yet, and no one online had encountered it thus far. Maybe I was its very first victim. I was outraged. This is just perfect, I said to myself, spewing all sorts of vulgarities, the likes of which would have resulted in no less than a dozen slaps from even the saltiest of nuns. I didn't want to deal with this right now. I didn't want to deal with it ever. But I especially didn't want to deal with it now. I left the computer for a while after that to just find some other way to wind down. I wasn't that successful. The next day, I was still pretty annoyed, but I was at least a little more level-headed than I was the day prior, and this was my weekend, so I would have plenty of time to figure this out. I called up the friend of mine whom I'd gotten the computer from, and she attested that she had no knowledge of any such file on it, nor of how it could have gotten there. She did offer to help me troubleshoot it, thankfully. After I told her all that I had done thus far, she seemed pretty convinced of my theory, that it was some brand new kind of virus without any currently known method of dealing with it. Unfortunately, she wasn't nearly skilled enough to try picking apart an unknown virus fresh off the market, so her help ended there. Great. With nothing left to do, I decided to experiment with the file. It took a full day to back up my important files on a separate drive, hopefully without the virus carrying over with it, and the following day I was able to start dealing with the thing. The file wasn't a standalone executable, or it would have run by itself when I double-clicked it. Having no knowledge of what program the file was intended to run with, I started cycling through all the programs on my computer, trying to find something that would work. First up was Notepad. As I've found, a lot of unknown files can be read in text format. This one turned up as a bunch of the missing character box symbols again. So it could be read as a text file, but it was all in another language. I guess that's a start. For lack of anything else to try, I continued through the list of programs. Next up was Windows Photo Viewer. I didn't expect anything to happen, since if the file had been opened in Notepad, that meant it had to be some kind of text-based file, right? Well, somehow, Photo Viewer was able to read the thing, and it came up with an image of a nice little suburban house somewhere. If it weren't for the subtle cultural hints, like the buildings in the background and the style of mailbox, I would have assumed it to be an American suburb. Unfortunately, there wasn't any kind of text anywhere in the image, so I couldn't determine the country of origin. I tried to move the window to the side for later, but accidentally closed it instead. So I tried to open the program again with Photo Viewer, and it worked again, but this time I got a different image. This one of the inside of a car driving on a brick road from the driver's perspective. How was this possible? Even assuming the file could be read in both Notepad and Photo Viewer, it's just one file. Opening it should come up with the same result each time. If this was a virus, it seemed to mess with the functions of my machine something fierce. I opened the file once again in Photo Viewer, and this time I got a string of big, bold, white symbols on a black background. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure they were Russian characters. Is that where this file is from? Russia? And the images too? Unfortunately, it was an image, so I couldn't copy the text and paste it into a search engine. I was curious though. I decided to take a screenshot of the text so I could look at it later. One print screen and MS Paint open later, I tried to paste what I'd copied. But again, the image wasn't the same. This time, it was a young woman, dressed in formal attire, looking at the camera expectantly. It was the craziest thing. Every time this file appeared on the screen, it was a new image. From there, I used the undo and redo keyboard commands to quickly erase and repaste the image over and over again. Every time, it was something different. A grocery store, a theatre, someone's living room, a man looking into a mirror, a pair of grave sites. After that, the next time I refreshed the image, I got this. It was a black screen with white text that read, "Get out." This made me jump a bit. Was this supposed to be addressed to me? Is this what the Russian text before translated to? Someone had to preload all these images into a slideshow and program them into this file. Maybe there were images of this message in all sorts of languages, and these were just the two I happened to encounter first. Still, something about the big, bold, white text message got to me, and I shut down Paint. Still, I was curious now. I wanted to know what other programs might be able to open this file. I tried Windows Media Player next, curious of how it might interpret the file. Apparently, it read it as audio. But curiously, the little seeker bar didn't move. As the file played, the time count went up, but the bar stayed at the far left, like it might if it were playing some kind of online live stream. The audio was a very clear recording of several people talking in Russian. Hearing it, I was now more certain of what language it was. It was also a hint that I heard dishes clanking and liquid being slurped as the word washed came up from time to time. I could only assume this was a recording of some family dinner or something. Why it was in the file, I have no idea. The audio was pretty mundane. After 5 minutes or so of nothing particularly interesting happening, I closed out and, this time, tried opening it in VLC Media Player. This time, it was read as video. I don't know why it would be any different between the two players, but the same thing happened in VLC, where the time count went up, but the bar never moved. Due to my computer's infection, the video ran extremely choppily. But what I could make out seemed to be a first-person view of someone sitting in an office, working on an assortment of paperwork. At times, I saw the viewer's reflection on his computer monitor, and it looked to be the same man who was looking at himself in the mirror in that image that appeared before. Curious, just to see what happened, I skipped ahead with the seek bar, trying to find other parts of the video. But as soon as I tried to move it from its position, glued to the left of the side window, VLC crashed and I was forced to shut it down. When I did, another Windows message had appeared beneath the window. Again, no title in the top bar and only one line of text. Stay out. Again, the options were yes and no. Just to see what would happen this time, I clicked no. That may have been a mistake. The window didn't close, but out of nowhere, my computer started whirring as if it were under an incredible strain, and the screen practically locked up. I tried moving my mouse, but I was unable to move out of the stay out window, which still had both options selectable. Thinking that maybe the computer was having trouble processing the command, I once again clicked no. This time, the reaction was even stronger. Countless message windows began popping up over the current one, all of them identical. Stay out, stay out, stay out, stay out. One after another, they rapidly began popping up over the last, slowing my computer to a literal snail's pace. I tried to move the mouse, and it very, very slowly crawled its way away from the no button. Hoping to just end this calamity at this point, I got it to meander over the yes command and finally clicked it. Just like that, the windows stopped appearing and the hard drive stopped whirring, and everything seemed to go back to normal. Or, at least, it went back to the way it was before I clicked no. The file was still there, and it still had to be taken care of. I tried once again to delete the file. This time, the message popped up reading, "Do not," with the only clickable option being, "OK." Odd. This message was different from the one I got last time I tried to delete it. Trying to X out of the message window did nothing. So, I reluctantly clicked OK, and it closed. I tried copying the file onto a drive, moving it off my computer, but I then received a Windows error message telling me that the file could not be moved because it is being accessed by another program. The same message came up when I tried just moving it to the desktop for easier access. I was curious to see whether this was true or not, and, actually, I hadn't taken a look at my processes to see if maybe there was something going on there that was making my system drag so much. I opened up Task Manager and switched over to the Processes tab, and, sure enough, at the top of the list was one called Anima. It was taking up almost a full 100% of my computer's processing power. Did that mean this file was not only occupying my whole hard drive, but most of my RAM as well? How big was this thing? Without another thought, I chose to end the process. This resulted in another Windows message. No title. This one said, "Please, no." These titleless messages weren't written by any Pulitzer Prize winner, that's for sure. The clickable options were no and no. Again, unable to X out. I clicked one of the two no's and the window closed. Underneath it, there was the typical Windows message asking me if I was sure I wanted to force end the process. Glad that the virus didn't interfere with this function, I clicked End Process and my hard drive whirred for a moment. Then, just like that, the process vanished. My CPU usage went back down to its normal levels, and finally I was able to use the machine freely again. However, the file was still there, in the folder. I could have deleted it then and there, but I wanted to check it once again, to be sure that no one else had encountered this little bugger yet. So, now that I was running at almost full speed, I did another search for .anima file type. Still, no results. On a final hunch, based on the name of the process I saw running, I tried doing a search for just anima. All this returned was that anima was a Latin word that functionally translates into English as soul. When I read that, it all hit me like a ton of bricks. That file, it couldn't possibly have been, could it? Was that .anima file a human soul? It had to be some kind of prank, played by someone trying to horrify people for a cheap laugh. All of this had to be programmed. A great big illusion, messing with my system's functionality and creating all of these pop-up messages, images and files just to trick me into thinking this could be a real person in digital format. Of course, the very idea is preposterous. Even if there were such a thing as a haunted computer or some military experiment to extract a human soul into digital format, there's no reason, no way it would wind up on my computer. How could that even have come about? Granted, I have no better explanation of how such a virus could have found its way into my system. The logical side of me knows better than to believe in some prankster's games. But still, the possibility, however small it may be, still haunts me. What if it really had been a person in there? Their life, their memories, their thoughts and feelings? If so, what had I just done by ending the process and terminating it from my system? This wasn't something I wanted to think about. I was determined to just delete the file so I would never have to think about it again. But before I did that, I had to know. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tried running the file again in all of the programs I had tried previously. Notepad now read it as an empty document. No matter what other program I used, it read only as an empty black screen, with faint static for audio. There was nothing left. Nothing. I never really considered myself to be much of an explorer, or even a particularly brave man. However, that hasn't seemed to stop me from getting in the predicament I'm in now. It was around 3 months ago that my girlfriend of 4 years left me for another man, and she really was the last tether keeping me grounded to any semblance of a social life. Don't get me wrong, I have friends that I love to see, but most live across the Metroplex, about an hour's drive, so it's a rare day when I make the effort to drive out there, and even more rare to have them drive out to see me. For the past 3 months, I've gone through most of the stages of a breakup: sorrow, self-pity, hopelessness, and anger. But even after taking a look at myself, I decided there were a few things I could improve. And although I'm not in particularly bad shape, I wanted to sculpt my physique to something more attractive to women. This is a problem, as I'm a fairly lazy man. Not everything in my life has to be handed to me, but I've learned to put the least amount of effort into any and all activities as possible. So rather than buying a gym membership and taking the 5-minute drive down the road, I decided I'd simply build myself a home workout center and do some ab blasting in my apartment. I only recently moved in this place about a month before my ex left me, sharing a 2-bedroom with absolutely no one. It lies in the far corner of the complex on the 2nd story, and the balcony gives me an excellent view of the enormous soccer fields and the woods beyond that. The only problem is, the landlady lives underneath me, and I learned fairly quickly that the whole home gym setup was a bust, as almost immediately when doing reps with the weights I bought, I heard the crotchety old woman banging on my floor with a broom handle, commanding me to keep it down. As irritating as it was walking on eggshells all the time, I supposed it was understandable. So I opted to cut corners some other way. And rather than doing the smart thing and hitting the gym, my eyes turned to the vast fields at my very doorstep. The fields were simply massive, stretching back several hundred yards, surrounded by dense woodland on all sides other than the front, which faced my apartments, and the equally large parking lot, which was sunken in such a way as to be unseen from the main road that led to it. It was October when I first checked out the fields. I live in Texas, so it doesn't get cold here until December, if at all. So I had plenty of time to get familiar with the area before winter hit. I only went at night, preferably past midnight or even 1 a.m, when the large floodlights were shut down and all the late-night teenagers were done with their shenanigans. I would slip through the decrepit fence that shoddily guarded my apartment and disappear into the night, and during this time, I felt amazing, completely uninhibited and alone, just the way I liked it. I would bring out my weights, do laps around the field, and heck, I even brought a few buddies out there once or twice to have some drinks and play soccer once it had cleared out. And although I will admit going out there in pitch black alone with nothing but the moonlight could be slightly unnerving at times, it was far better than the alternative, at least at first. As my isolation grew, my sleep schedule strayed from the norm, and it wasn't long before I found myself awake at odd hours of the night, and about a week ago was a particularly rough one. After fruitlessly lying in bed for almost an hour and not even feeling my eyelids flutter once, I realized my efforts to fall asleep were futile, and I found myself crawling out of bed at 1 a.m. It's strange. Many of the times I find myself drawn to the field. It's almost as if I'm not in control of my body movements or even my own thoughts. And as I threw on a jacket in preparation for the chilly embrace outside, I glanced out my bedroom window, finding, to my bemusement, that the floodlights in the field were still on. Because it was so late, I figured one of the workers must have forgot to turn off the light for the night, and initially thought little of it, grabbed my phone and headed outside. I was feeling strangely courageous that night, confidently strutting out onto the barren field, dropping off my shirt and my jacket near the edge, feeling like the biggest man in the world. And after putting some music on my phone, I headed to the center of the wasteland, halfway expecting to see someone out there waiting for me. The overpowering luminescence of the floodlights, combined with the sharp contrast of the utter and complete darkness of the forest encompassing it, made for an odd sensation indeed, but I still found myself walking to the centre of the field and simply observing my surroundings. In the darkness, in the early hours of the morning, it is easy for one's mind to play tricks on them, and it was not uncommon for me in the past to do a double take over my shoulder whenever I thought I saw a shadow sprinting through the night, only to see a harmless flag, or feel a wave of fear crawl up my spine when I heard a rustling behind me, only to discover a plastic bag in the breeze. But this night felt different. The glaring light cast long, dark shadows across the field, and as I marched around, cold and alone, with only David Bowie blaring from my phone to keep me company, I felt remarkably uncomfortable. After kicking a soccer ball around the field for less than 5 minutes, a strong gust of wind hit my shirtless body, leaving me shuddering involuntarily. But this was met by a loud clanging sound of metal on metal from the woods at the edge of the field, which halted my shuddering almost immediately as I stood, still as a statue, with goosebumps quickly forming up my arms. As I mentioned, it was not uncommon for there to be noises around the field, even at night, and I quickly rationalized that the wind had knocked something against the large metal garbage can at the edge of the field, creating the clanging noise I had heard earlier, and I continued with my workout, still in the zone, but alert. David Bowie abruptly shut off, jarring me into glancing at my phone. Damn it, I thought out loud. The battery had died. That's when I heard the clanging noise again, and my head snapped back towards where I perceived the noise to have originated from. I waited several seconds. No wind this time. For those who don't know, in a large field such as this, it's nearly impossible to pinpoint where a noise is coming from because of the effect echoes can have in such a wide, unobstructed space. But I had a distinct feeling it was not coming from the garbage can at the other end of the field. I had enough fun for the night. Without glancing back, I put my phone in my pocket and started jogging away from the center of the field and back towards the hole in the fence that led directly to my apartment. And that's when it happened. The floodlights went out. I kid you not, every single one of the damn lights turned off instantly. Here I was, damn near naked, eyes watering from the cold and goosebumps covering every inch of my body, when darkness took the field. That's when my jog turned into a sprint. I felt exposed, alone, and oh so vulnerable. I'm not a feeble or cowardly man, but I knew anyone or anything out there messing with me so late at night had to be even crazier than I was. I still had about 100 yards to run when I glanced behind me. I don't know whether to be grateful or terrified that I saw nothing in the shadows of the night, but either way, I ran harder and faster than I had in a long, long time. My terror was so severe, I completely forgot to grab my shirt or jacket, but immediately relief overtook me once I entered the premise of the complex, squeezing through the broken fence, racing up the stairs, and slamming and locking the door behind me. Breathing heavily, I stumbled over to the kitchen table, my legs and lungs both burning with white-hot pain. I was shaken, but I was alright. I threw on a shirt, almost completely forgetting about the one I left behind, and started boiling some water for some tea when I knew I could finally relax. And that's when I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 knocks on my door, my front door, at 2 in the morning. Law enforcement. That was the first thought I had. They had finally busted me for trespassing all those times. But I figured if I just calmly explained myself, maybe they'd let me off with a warning. I walked over to my door and grabbed my doorknob. But something stopped me from turning and pulling it open. Instead, I lowered my eye to the circular peephole in the door, figuring I might as well see who it was before I opened. I shakily backed away from the door, with goosebumps immediately re-emerging on my arms and neck as the familiar sensation of dread radiated throughout my body. I glanced at the door to make sure it was locked, and for good measure ran up and threw on the deadbolt, when a second series of thumps reverberated throughout my small apartment. My view of the peephole had been completely black, meaning someone had covered it for a reason that God only knew. But it couldn't have been good. I went out to get my jacket and shirt the next day when the sun was high in the sky, bringing some semblance of warmth and order to the world. The field was full of parents and kids happily playing soccer, but my articles were gone, along with any signs that anyone or anything was out there the night before. That was 5 days ago. And every night since, the lights in the field have remained on until 2 a.m. without fail. And every single night, at the same time, I hear the metallic clanging in the field, whether there be wind or not, followed soon by that familiar thudding at my door. I suppose going to my apartment immediately after was a poor choice, as now, whatever's out there in that field knows who I am and knows where I live. I don't know what to do. I think I should move. Maybe I'll move back with my parents. I don't know. I need to get away, and I'm terrified. It was this morning that really sent me over the edge. I opened my door at 8 a.m. in order to head to work, when I nearly stepped on something. I picked up the ragged piece of cloth apprehensively, thinking it to be a garment of some homeless vagrant, when it dawned on me. Although horribly mutilated and torn to shreds, it was still recognizable. I dropped the cloth in horror. It was my jacket. Even now, as I write this, I regret to inform you. I hear it. Knock, knock, knock. I have always been a scrawny person since I was in elementary school. Granted, due to my semi-decent sense of humour, I was never bullied. But to the opposite sex, I was never deemed attractive or dateable. Friendzone was the nation I inhabited, and until the age of 25, I was completely fine with it. Of course, I craved the attention when it came time for the homecoming dance or prom, but I always managed to get a friend that went with me out of pity. After high school, I went to a local college and graduated 5 years later. I ran out of funds, so I worked in sales after my sophomore year to make enough money for my last 2 years. On my graduation day, I looked back on the years I spent in college and immediately felt regret. Every day after my classes, I would just go back home and eat dinner with my parents and go to my bedroom where I would spend the whole night surfing the web and reading. I made a couple of friends and had a date that ended terribly, but I just felt like I never truly utilized college for all of its worth. I was accepted into an out-of-state college, but I decided against it because I did not want to get out of my comfort zone. After college, I tried to find a job that went along with my major, English, and found that it is pretty much impossible to get a teaching job in the town I lived in. After 4 months of looking for a job, I decided that any job was as good as any and went to the local electronics store for my old job back. The manager was more than happy to take me back as I was the top seller every month I was there. I don't like to go out and make friends, but I was definitely good at making people spend their money. When I came back for my first day back 3 days later, I realized it was a completely different crew except the manager. There were 3 salesmen, Mac, Vance, and Jonathan, and the manager, Anthony. Before I came back in, Mac was the top salesman for the past 6 months, and we automatically did not like each other. Vance was the lowest salesman, but he always cleaned the store up and made sure all of the inventory was correct. Jonathan was the middle tier salesman, and we became fast friends. There really isn't much to talk about in the world of sales. People come in looking for X object, and we sell them X object while trying to add on accessories. Sometimes we would get them to loosen on their original budget and go for a higher end model. That is about as far as sales really go to me. It gets me a paycheck, and I can pay the rent my mother and father suddenly started charging me. 3 weeks into working there, Jonathan asked me if I wanted to go over to his house, hang out, and drink a couple of beers. I agreed, and after work, we went there and turned on a couple of movies while downing beer after beer. After 3 hours, I decided it was time for me to go home, but Jonathan rationalized with me about the dangers of driving drunk. He brought out 2 pillows and a blanket. He pointed at the couch, and I sat back down. He put the blanket and pillows beside me and told me good night while he walked back to his room. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I remember snapping awake. I have this thing ever since I was young where I would slightly open my eyes in case it's already bright, but I found the room to be completely dark. I slightly glanced up, trying to figure out where I was, but what I saw made me close my eyes completely and start shaking a little. Jonathan was standing in the hallway while staring at me. I waited around 10 minutes and slightly opened my eyes once more to see that he was going back into his room. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of bacon. I quickly got out of bed and went to his kitchen. He was cooking and looking like his normal self, so I just let my paranoia slide off and I asked him if he needed any help. With a wave of his hand, he just told me to sit down and enjoy my hangover. I sat down on the couch until it was done cooking, and we ate bacon and pancakes. We went to work right after breakfast, and by the end, I completely forgot about him staring at me in the middle of the night. The next weekend, he asked me if I wanted to go out to a club an hour away from us, and without hesitation, I told him yes. I told him I would wear my black suit to look extra spiffy, and while laughing, he told me he would pick me up from my house around 10 p.m. Around 10:15, I heard him honking, and I went outside and got into his car. When I saw him, I had to take a double take. He was wearing the exact same thing as me. Black suit and a white button-up shirt. I just decided to ignore it. We got to the club at 11, right as the doors were opening. And before it was midnight, I was having the time of my life. For the first time in my life, I was meeting girls that seemed to take an interest in me, and I even got to dance with a couple of them. The only thing that really threw me off was that Jonathan seemed to be staring down every girl that even gave me the slightest bit of interest. At 2, Jonathan came up to me and told me it was time to go home, so I went to the bar to pay off my tab. While I was paying my tab, a girl that I danced with earlier came up to me and slipped me a piece of paper in my pocket while giving me a light peck in my cheek. I know I blushed, but I maintained my composure enough to give her a wink and a smile. When I got into the car, I took out the piece of paper and showed Jonathan. Nearly bouncing in my seat with excitement, I told him that she was definitely a girl that I would not mind dating. He asked me what she looked like, so I told him that she was a little shorter than me, brown hair and green eyes. Then I started to explain to him how pretty she was. But I had noticed he changed his expression from happiness to what seemed like anger. The whole car ride was filled with awkward silences and sideways glances from Jonathan. I felt like he had gotten a bit too weird for me, so I started to avoid him at work. It worked for the first 3 days, but I noticed that he had started to follow me around. When I was driving home, I would see his car from a distance away. Sometimes, when I was lying in bed, I would spot a set of eyes coming from the trees in front of my house. But every single time I would walk up to the window, I would see the eyes vanish. I didn't really know it was him until I saw a figure with bright green shoes running down the street. I know Jonathan is the only person I have ever seen wear bright green shoes. They were the shoes he wore whenever he went out running or whenever he exercised. I decided that the next day would be the best day to approach him and tell him that I noticed him following me after work and looking into my window. I was going to tell my only and best friend that I would really appreciate it if he could just give me some space until I thought he was back to normal. That next day, the store was closed. The store was closed because Jonathan was found in the middle of the night by the police with a giant gaping hole in his chest. His heart was removed and placed in his mouth. Where his heart should have been was a credit card from our store. The magnetic strip was rubbed off and the name of the card was grinded off. On his stomach was a series of cuts to reveal a little note. Was it worth the sale? I know I wanted him to give me some space, but I never wanted him to die. He was my only best friend, and the grief that filled my heart when my manager called and told me the news caused me to hang up on him and fall on my bed. With deep sobs, I felt the world was crashing down on me, and I never felt like he ever knew how much he really meant to me. Today is the day after Jonathan was found dead. I decided to go to the mall to clear my head. I went outside to my car and found a letter stuck in my window. I grabbed the letter and read it in my car. Hey Dan, I'm sure you've noticed that I've been following you around and that I've been acting weird around you. I know on the first night you spent over, you saw me staring at you on the couch. I just wanted you to know that on the first week, Mac convinced an older woman to make an $8,100 TV purchase using our store credit card. The next day, the woman came back with the TV. It had a big crack in the middle of the screen, but she told us it had come that way. Normally, we just return it and get our money back from the manufacturer, but Mac did not want to lose out on the commission. It was the last one we had in stock, and he wanted to have the upper hand on you. She started to beg and plead to just take the TV back and let her buy a cheaper model. She told him that she didn't even have the money to pay the monthly bill. He just told her she was out of luck and made her take the TV back into her car. That night, she killed herself. She was clutching a remote in her left hand and an empty bottle of pills in her right hand. The daughter came in 3 days later. It was your day off, but Mac was there. She went up to him and told him about the death of her mother. She didn't seem sad, but I could tell she was not here to ask about what can be done about the bill. With a smile, she asked who the salesman was, and the asshole told her it was you and described what you looked like. With a smile, she skipped out the door and drove off in a red sedan. When you spent the night, I woke up to the sound of a car engine starting up around 2 a.m. I looked out the window and saw that same red sedan. When we were going to the club, I saw the red sedan following us. When you described to me about the girl that gave you her number, it matched what she looked like exactly. I just wanted to make sure you were safe, so I followed you home and I kept watch over you. Tonight, I invited her over. I took the piece of paper she wrote you her number on and texted her. She said she will be here at 2 a.m. I know I may not be alive when you read this, but I want you to know that I love you, man. I know we haven't been friends for long, but just know that I acted like a creep around you because I wanted to make sure you were safe. I lived next to this one kid who always had bandages wrapped around their whole head, even covering his face. I remembered his name was Wilbur, a 12-year-old boy who never left his house. Sometimes he looked out of his bedroom window on the top floor at all of the kids who would play outside, while Wilbur sat and watched. I remembered his window had metal bars on them, so there was no way he could climb out of his bedroom windows. We sometimes communicated to each other by writing to each other on pieces of paper, since Wilbur can't hear me because the windows were locked. Wilbur only does it when his parents aren't around, since they're weird. His mother and father were one of those parents that were insanely crazy about science and chemistry, according to Wilbur. They would stay in their basement and work all day and night, except at the times where they had to give Wilbur some food daily. Now, they're not treating him like an animal. His parents were just very busy. They told Wilbur that he shouldn't go outside to make contact with anyone until his face got better. He told me that he accidentally slipped on one of his parents' chemicals and fell face first, ruining his appearance, and his parents feared that he would be made fun of by the other kids in the neighborhood. I remember one time, a couple of older kids were throwing rocks and pebbles at his windows, laughing and pointing at Wilbur as he looked down at them. He told me that they do it a few times, but he's used to it. But to me, he's a great guy, and still is. I have never been inside his house, but he showed me some cool stuff he collected, like comic books. He had lots of them, from Marvel to DC to other non-superhero comics. He was a huge superhero fan. He even said that he felt like a superhero. A normal human being who became affected by dangerous chemicals and then became a powerful superhero. He once wrote on a piece of paper and had it put up to his window as he pretended to be a superhero. I had a collection of action figures and video games that amazed Wilbur. He told me that he never played a single video game in his life, which was quite sad. He also told me that his babysitter took them away from him before he could play them and burnt them in front of his eyes. Wilbur had a mean babysitter named Miss Fitzgerald, a tall, mean lady who never liked kids at all. This started before his face became messed up, he told me. She was basically every kid's nightmare of all the things I heard she has done. Miss Fitzgerald had babysat many kids before, and trust me, it was not pretty. Wilbur told me that the last kid she babysat, a 4-year-old girl, she made her live through 7 hours of hell. Wilbur said that Miss Fitzgerald starved her and surrounded her bed with a few bear traps, and the worst thing that happened, the parents didn't know about her deed. She would lie to them just to get paid. Of all the things I've heard, she is a foul, cruel woman with no soul at all. And now she had to babysit this poor guy. Wilbur was old enough to make his own decisions, except for some, but his parents apparently hired an evil witch. The parents had to go to Texas to a science convention, so Wilbur was left alone with her. One time, I was writing about her to show him, but then I saw Miss Fitzgerald forcibly pulling him away from the window, and that was the rest of my day without talking to him. The next day, I looked through my window to see Wilbur. I saw someone lying down on his bed. Looking at the person's wrapped head, I banged my fist on the window, trying to get Wilbur's attention. He slowly sat up on his bed, wiping away tears from his eyes. He seemed to be crying, which that gave me a thought. I had a worried look on my face as I saw the bruises all over his arms and legs, a faded dark tone of purple. He went to write something down on a piece of paper. Then, as Wilbur finished writing, he went up to the window and pressed the note against the glass. What he wrote terrified me. The whole situation still burned in the back of my mind, something I knew I wouldn't forget. He wrote, "Help me." What made it worse was that his handwriting was scribbled onto the paper and was almost illegible. Wilbur kept banging on the window with his other hand. Then, suddenly, I saw someone else run into his bedroom next to him. It was her. You know who? She had something in both of her big, chubby hands. In one hand was a lemon, and in the other was a pair of scissors. What Miss Fitzgerald did terrified me even more. Miss Fitzgerald ran up to Wilbur, grabbing his head, holding it still. I saw him screaming in pain and fear, so I knew I had to do something. At the same time, I couldn't stop watching. She used her scissors to cut open the bandages and unwrapped them off his head and threw them to the side. What I saw almost made me vomit, something that sickened me. I was utterly shocked at looking at Wilbur's real, deformed face. His whole head was completely covered by bandages, and what was underneath, I knew the purpose to. I saw his face almost melted off, showing a dark red layer underneath. I can only imagine his face looking like melted cheese on a cheeseburger. Wilbur's whole face, even one of his eyeballs, were burnt a bit. The chemicals had messed him up badly. Miss Fitzgerald sliced the lemon in half with the scissors, pinning Wilbur down on his bed. Then she threw the scissors to the side next to the bandages and held his head with one hand. With the other hand, she squeezed lemon onto Wilbur's head, into his eyes, into the red layer of his face. The painful expression on his face, his loud, muffled screams, his face stinging from the acid of the lemon juice. She used the other lemon to squeeze onto his face again, torturing Wilbur with extreme pain. I decided to bang my fist on the window, which was a bad idea. Miss Fitzgerald looked over to the bedroom window, right at me. I jumped back. She noticed me. She ran back out of the bedroom, shoving Wilbur down as he screamed in agony and pain. I knew what she was going to do, so I ran out of my bedroom and ran downstairs. The good thing about this situation was that my parents don't know about Wilbur and the fact that they are at work for a little bit. I locked the front door, hoping that Miss Fitzgerald wouldn't burst into my house. I looked around for the house phone, but as I was, a loud bang rang in my ears. I looked behind myself at the door, noticing her red, sweaty face and her curly blonde hair. By the looks in her eyes, I knew there was going to be some trouble. She kept banging at the door, nearly screaming her head off. As I looked around for the phone, I finally spotted it next to the couch on the coffee table. I ran towards it, dialing 911 as the sounds of Miss Fitzgerald's threatening screams were heard from outside. Waiting for a few rings, I finally hear the operator's voice, the usual greeting from a 911 operator. I started explaining the whole situation from beginning to end as quickly and clearly as possible. They told me to wait patiently as the police will arrive at my house soon. It took a few minutes for the police to arrive at my house. Not only did they arrive, but my parents arrived early from work as well. Apparently, they got a call from the police explaining my situation and decided to come home. My parents were extremely worried and frightened. They asked me more questions about it than the police did. I had to explain everything, from being friends with Wilbur to how his parents had left him with an abusive babysitter to what she tried to do. About an hour later, a police officer came to me. He had something he wanted to tell me about the horrible atrocities that took place next door. The truth about the babysitter, the parents, and Wilbur was truly shocking. Based on the evidence they found, Wilbur's parents weren't his actual parents at all. They adopted Wilbur from an orphanage that's out of town, only to perform an experiment on him. It was the reason why they moved to Texas, to hide. The babysitter, Miss Fitzgerald, was part of the experiment too. In fact, Wilbur wasn't the first kid to get adopted by the scientists. They had done illegal experiments on those orphans, and it was to find out how much pain a child can take before death, based on the cause of death and the age of the child. 38 children between the ages of 2 and 13 were reported missing, and Wilbur was one of them. There were security cameras on the outside and inside of the house. Right now, they arrested Miss Fitzgerald for child cruelty and the deaths of many children, and are on the case to find the 2 scientists. All of that, and I was friends with someone who would have been killed if I didn't call the police. Apparently, Wilbur also tried to lie about almost everything he told me. He was trying to protect himself. He was sent to a new trusted family, a married couple who lived out of town. Since then, I never saw him again until now. 20 years later, I went to a bar to get myself a few drinks by myself when a man approached me. "Remember me?" he said, that familiar man smiling at me. I smiled back, realizing how long it had been since I last seen Wilbur. In fact, he looks like a nice, healthy man now, without his bandages. He was a brown-haired man with sky blue eyes. He almost looked like a complete stranger. After that, we talked and drank a few glasses, finally speaking to each other in person. Wilbur and I knew that nobody would try to keep us apart. The scientists and the babysitter are probably locked away right now. After all, I still couldn't stop thinking of the fact that this man would have been killed if I didn't help save his life.